What is up guys, Blue Spooky here with the midweek best of mix. If you guys end up enjoying this compilation video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe, as that helps to ensure the video does well and that I can keep making these videos daily for a long time to come. If you guys have any thoughts about the stories in this video, please be sure to leave them in the comments below, as one of my favorite things about these recordings is reading your guys' thoughts in the comments. Without further ado, I will let you guys enjoy the compilation, and I will see you again at the end of the video. Thanks for watching. This happened on a warm summer day when my twin and I were just 8 years old. We were heading to an ice cream shop with our mother. Cass and I were super excited because we almost never had money to go out and get a treat like this. We dressed up in matching summer dresses that had a cat chasing a ball of yarn on the bottom of the dress. Hers was pink and mine was purple. We both had our long hair done up in pigtails. We entered the shop and were excited, deciding what flavor of ice cream we were going to get today. At a table no more than 4 feet away from the door, an old man made a strange noise. He meowed like a cat, and when we looked over at him, he was licking at his hand and purring like a cat would. He pointed at our dresses, where the cats were, and smiled, revealing a major lack of teeth. Once more, he began meowing, making intense eye contact with us. We both just looked at each other, trying to hold back our laughter. He then made a hissing noise and reached for us. My mother, who had been watching from the front of us, after hearing the hiss, gave the old man a strange look and told us to keep walking. With the distraction of ice cream, my sister and I were completely sidetracked until we had to find a place to sit. My mother tactically picked the seats farthest away from this strange meowing old man. We were really enjoying our ice cream, making a bit of a mess actually, when the old man casually tiptoed over so that he was sitting at the table right in front of my sister and I. He was also behind my mother's back. He began licking at his hands again and staring at us, then began loudly meowing and attempting to purr. My mother got another strange look on her face, but she didn't turn around to look at the man. She just told us we were going to have to finish up outside. Unfortunately, we had to walk directly by him to leave. As we passed by, he pointed at us and in a weird high-pitched voice called out, "You like kitties? I'm a kitty myself. Take me home with you. I just want some lovings." He meowed again. With that, he began to stand up as if he were going to leave with us. Before my mother could even make sense of what to say, a man from a neighboring table, who must have overheard all of this, stood up. They stood between the man and us. "Yeah, I don't think so, pal." That's all the man said. I remember before leaving, I glanced over at that man's table, where his 2 sons were sitting. They were giving us equally weirded out looks at the situation that just occurred right in front of them. I shrugged as if to say I didn't know what this was all about either. My mom thanked the man who interfered, and we left, forcing her to choose between having 2 messy 8-year-olds eating melting ice cream in the car, or wait until we were done, with the possibility the strange cat man might come out and start following us. The entire way home, we had to lean out the car windows. The silence was only broken by humming noises and the occasional meow sound from my sister and I, followed by a giggle. Yeah, that was a really strange and creepy thing to happen in public. I don't know how we didn't get more weirded out at the time. This story may be very distressing for some. I've had some horrible experiences in the past, and I want to share these with all of you. It happened about 2 years ago. I got a job and moved out of my family home. One night, I was walking home from the station as usual. It wasn't a long walk at all. only about 5 minutes in total. I was heading home that night when I suddenly felt as if something was out of place. I felt as though someone was following me. I turned around, but I didn't see anyone. I thought that maybe I was just being paranoid or something. But this odd feeling lasted about a week. Every time I was heading home after work from the station, I would feel that feeling as if I were not alone. It bothered me so much that I spoke to a work colleague about it. He told me that if I was worried or scared about what was happening, then I should tell somebody like the police or something. I didn't really think I had anything to go on. I mean, what could they even do about it if I told them I thought I was being followed? I just tried not to think about it. Then one night, though, something happened, and my paranoia was deemed justified. I got a letter at work that was addressed to me. I opened it, and immediately I began to scream. All that was inside was a simple note that said, "I'm always watching you." I showed it to my boss, but he didn't really seem to care. He wasn't interested at all, to be honest. This really scared me, though. I didn't know if it was just a prank because I had told my colleagues about my fears. I thought that note would be the worst thing that would happen, but I was proven wrong. Eventually, I got a call from a private number. I picked it up, and a male voice answered. "Are you just getting in? A little earlier than usual tonight, huh?" I was really scared and full of anxiety, but somehow I managed to muster up the courage to ask in what I guess was a very shaky voice, "Who are you?" I knew full well that this was likely the person who had been following me, the one who had sent that creepy letter to my workplace. "You're the guy that's been following me, aren't you?" He replied something along the lines of, "Oh, you noticed, huh? What a sharp sense of intuition you have. I'm actually surprised." I said I was going to call the police. "That doesn't matter," he replied instantly. I felt my spirit sinking in my chest like a lead weight. I hung up on the man and spent that night awake late, thinking there was nothing I could do about the situation. I felt so hopeless, I could barely sleep. I did come out of the situation, though, thinking that maybe it wasn't completely helpless. By the morning, I'd figured that whoever was stalking me knew my work and train schedule, so I decided to go to work by car instead. It was a little more inconvenient, but after that call, I didn't feel safe sat opposite a stranger on the train. I was still scared, though. I told my coworkers about what was going on. For a long while, there was actually nothing else. I figured the stalker must have now given up and lost interest. My fears returned, though, when I opened a letter one night after work. The letter had not been addressed. It had been hand-delivered. I knew the sender before I read a single word. This is what it said. "Yesterday, I saw a friend come over. You and her talked about me, huh? I'm so glad you care about me and that I'm a part of your life." Throughout the letter, it spoke of the contents of my friend and I's conversation. It was horrible. It was like somehow this person knew all my inner thoughts. I thought about it for a long while. The most logical conclusion I could come up with was that someone had somehow hidden a listening device somewhere in my home. If that was true, and I felt like it was 1,000% true at the time, it must have meant that someone had gone into my apartment. Some stranger had gotten in somehow. If you ever suspect this might have happened to you, you'll know how that realization makes you feel, so incredibly violated. I sat there thinking, I must have had a bunch of friends and coworkers over, not to mention the previous tenant that lived there and anyone they brought as well. I had no idea who the culprit could be. I mostly had women over since I'm a woman as well, but come to think of it, I'd had a mix of guys and girls over for a drinking party once. Coworkers and some other guys had been there too, some other friends also. I had no idea if any of them were shady or capable of becoming a stalker like this. And there seemed to be no way to figure out who the guy harassing me was. It's not like I could just move out either. I just didn't have the money to do so. I didn't want a couple of weird letters and calls to let me leave the place I really loved. What was my alternative? Go back home and live with mom and dad? They weren't exactly local. Talking about my parents will send me down a whole nother rabbit hole, though. I just waited to see if things would quiet down after that, like it did before. I just kind of thought, maybe hoped is the operative word here, that the stalker had moved on. 3 months went by incident-free. I had returned to my usual work-life rhythm, and my confidence was starting to get back to where it was. I tried to carry on like nothing had happened. Things were all good for a while, until I came to a startling realization. I was missing something from my bedroom. Underwear. I was missing some underwear. At first, I thought all the usual thoughts, oh, did I lose it somewhere? I could understand me losing one article of clothing, like a bra or some panties or something. That kind of stuff happens to everyone, right? But 3? That's pretty weird. I live on the 2nd floor of an apartment block, and I never dried my clothes outside on the balcony. Therefore, for them to have gone missing meant they must have been removed from my apartment directly. I knew that something very strange was going on. It was terrifying. I returned one night to find a memo attached to the fridge. It was just on your run-of-the-mill post-it note. My mom would actually come over sometimes and leave me something on the fridge like that. So at first, I thought it was a note from my mom, maybe. I took one look at the post-it note without reading its contents, and that told me already it was not written by my mother. Have you noticed that your underwear is missing? I guess you're wondering where it's gone, huh? Well, I have it. I was scared to the point which I didn't know what to do. I was being terrorized. I was being harassed. I called the police. I must have sounded so odd and dumb, but I told them everything that was going on. They were not the most helpful people to contact in that situation. I mean, they did listen and would try to help me and talk to me, but there wasn't much they could do without any evidence. They told me that the best bet would be to just move. It would be easier for everyone to just move apartments. That seemed to be the message coming out of everyone, my colleagues and friends too. Once again, I have to say I could not afford to do so. That's great advice for someone who has some extra money lying around, but I just couldn't do it. I hatched a genius plan after this. I figured that if I replaced the locks on all my doors and windows, then the trouble would end. I mean, replacing some locks seemed a lot cheaper and a lot less of a hassle than moving away. I felt like it worked for a while. I even left a pile of my underwear on the coffee table just to see if someone would snatch some away. For about 2 weeks or so, they'd remained untouched. Honestly, it was a temporary fix though. I mean, I couldn't really live there anymore confidently. I was a little reluctant at the time to admit that. I guess it was down to it being the first place I'd ever lived alone. I was unwilling to give it up to outside forces. I didn't want to be home alone at night though, so I decided to solve that problem by getting a night shift job. I did it on the hush-hush, not telling anyone and getting the cash by hand. If my day job knew I was moonlighting, I might have been in trouble anyway. I know, their sympathy for me and my situation is truly heartwarming, isn't it? My new part-time job kept me out of the house at night and helped me to save up some money. I decided to use some of that money I'd saved to get security cameras and some surveillance as well. I thought that if I found out who was doing this to me, I could finally show the evidence to the police and stop it all. Maybe I wouldn't have to move then. In Japan, honestly, stalking laws are quite lacking. They won't do much until something quote-unquote happens. They weren't going to help me. I figured I needed to try and help myself, right? I was really scared. I should say that I hated it. I hated that I had to work 2 jobs and be stressed all day and night. I was afraid of every guy that passed me on the street, not knowing who could be the one harassing me. The ones who smiled politely scared me the most. It wasn't their fault that I was scared, but that's how I would describe that period of my life. Things got a little better when a friend of mine reached out to me. He met me at work for lunch. We were close friends back in the start of our careers. We both joined the company at about the same time, so we'd gone through training and everything together. It was great to see him again, actually. He was really sweet and listened to all my complaints and troubles and tried to offer his own kinds of advice as well. He was such a nice guy during this tough time in my life that I ended up relying on him whenever I was down or upset. After having changed the locks, I felt as if I was free again. Nothing happened for the longest time. Then, about a half a year after the lock change, something else happened. I had to leave my job due to some family reasons. I was disappointed to be quitting. I guess for some it looked as if I was throwing in the towel or something. It certainly felt that way to me at times. In all honesty, though, it was out of my control. I broke the news to everyone and had a farewell party at work. I broke the news to the guy who had helped me through the tough times as well. I moved back to my hometown and settled back in. After a little while, he messaged me and said something like, "Hey, it's been a while. How you doing? Could we chat for a bit?" He invited me to meet him somewhere close by, and I accepted. The guy who'd been so nice to me got in touch and offered to come see me. I felt great about it, actually. It was like someone from a life I'd had once before was coming back to save me from my current life at home. I guess that doesn't make much sense unless you're me. Being back home was very rough. I guess that I was feeling nostalgic for the freedom I'd had before. I had a new job and things were going somewhat well. He wanted to meet me near a park close to my workplace. When we met up, we walked around the park a couple of times. We talked about work and life and a couple of memories we had together. I told him how I quit my job and all that stuff. He seemed happy I was doing well. I wanted to get across that I was in a much better place and genuinely happier than I thought I would have been to move back home. That was when he said something really strange. "I guess you don't care about my feelings then, huh? It's really insensitive, you know." I didn't really understand what he was talking about or where this was coming from. I wondered if I'd accidentally said something rude to him or took his sympathetic ear for granted. I'm sorry. I guess I shouldn't have unloaded all that trauma on you during those rough days. I thought you didn't mind, though. Did you not want to hear about all that stuff?" He replied as quick as a flash. "Yeah, I hate that stuff." It went super quiet. There was a weird atmosphere after he said that. I didn't want to talk to him anymore. Suddenly, he leaned over toward me and covered my mouth with his hand. I was scared and shocked by his actions. He covered my nose and mouth, and I couldn't breathe. As soon as he did that, I knew this guy was the guy who had been stalking me. I began to tremble. I felt as if I couldn't speak. I managed to utter a few shaky words. "You followed me. You were in my apartment." "Oh, good for you, huh? She finally noticed. God, I never knew you were this insensitive. I thought we were friends." "I didn't know," I said. "Well, we're very different people, aren't we? I wanted you to be mine. I tried to show you my intentions for months, but here I am again ending up in the goddamn friend role. I mean, how stupid are you? Can't you read the signs?" I was shaking like a leaf. He had his hands clamped over my mouth still, and one was digging into my shoulder. "Why didn't you notice me sooner?" I started to say some kind of muffled reply, and he cut me off. "Can't have you saying anything else." I had only known his kind and gentle side before that day. I didn't know he was capable of such blatant anger and evil. I could have never imagined he would flip out like this. I tried to break away from him, but he was too strong. He was scaring the living hell out of me. What he said next really made a shiver run down my spine. Relax. I don't want you to be mine in a place like this, but if you keep resisting, I guess I'll have to do it right here." The park was positively empty. He must have known it wasn't a popular one. I felt as if we were the only two people here. Just when it looked like he was about to do something terrible to me, I could see a dark look of contemplation dance across his face. At that point, someone else, should I say a dog walker, entered the park as well. I believe this had been highly unexpected for him. so he let go of me for a moment to appear normal. I looked toward the dog walker. I wanted to plead with her with my eyes to show her something was wrong here, and it wasn't my choice. When I locked eyes with this dog walker, I realized I recognized this person. She was a friend of mine, actually. She rushed over to me. Her dog wasn't a small dog, so the creep started walking toward the exit of the park quite quickly. I was left hyperventilating in her arms. The only word I could muster was why. She replied that she'd always suspected he was the guy that was following me. She told me later that he had made no secret that he liked me. He told numerous people at work that he had a crush on me. She felt I was the only one who didn't know this. When all that stuff started happening to me at work, people naturally looked his way. They couldn't do anything though because he quit the company right as the locks got changed. I didn't know he'd quit because I barely knew this guy existed until he interrupted while I was at my lowest point. Apart from when I'd first started working at the company, I really didn't see him at all. He was much older than me. He was told as he was leaving by the people at work that if anything happened to me or my place, the police would be called and he would be the first suspect. I guess that's around the point when half a year went by without him doing anything. It all started to make sense to me. It turned out that my friend wasn't there by chance either. She'd seen this guy heading in the direction of my parents' home and decided to follow us to the park. Thank God she did. After everything that went down, I managed to move out of my parents' home and get my own place. The company I worked for is still operating just fine. I moved miles and miles away now, though. It was a horrible time for me. I didn't ever go back to that secluded park again. I often think about how close I came to having something irreversibly horrible be done to me by someone I thought was a close friend. It's something that terrifies me on a daily basis. I was 23 years old when this happened and was living in the city of brotherly love at the time, Philadelphia. The girl I was dating lived about 35 to 45 minutes out of the city. After hanging out for a while, I left her place at around 12:30 a.m. or so. I really shouldn't have stayed out that late because I had an early shift that morning. As soon as I left her neighborhood, I noticed that my gas light was on. I put in directions to the nearest gas station on my GPS and drove 5 minutes to the local Wawa. I was familiar with this area, and it was very low on crime, unlike many other places outside of Philly. Stopping here late at night wasn't something I was particularly nervous about because of this. There were 2 other cars parked there when I pulled in. I filled up my tank and realized that 2 of my tires were low on air as well. I drove to the corner of the parking lot where they had the air pumps stationed. I started working on my first tire. When I looked up, I saw an older pickup truck pulling into the lot. I didn't really think twice about it until it drove up right next to my car. And the truck began backing into the area where the other air pump was. Any other day, I would have just assumed it was someone else trying to put air into their tires, but something gave me a bad feeling about this. The driver exited the truck and looked at me. He was in his late 50s or early 60s and had scruffy facial hair. He had glasses as well and kind of looked like a stereotypical creeper. He just stood by his driver's side door and stared at me. This was when I began to feel more uneasy. "Is your pump out of order, sir?" I tried to ask, trying to break the tension. The man didn't respond, though. He just kept giving me a cold stare. He finally moved away from the door and reached into the bed of his truck, his eyes never leaving me. He produced a rope and began sprinting toward me. I immediately threw down the air nozzle and jumped into my car, which was already running. I threw it into drive when suddenly a hand slammed directly on my driver's side window. It dragged sideways as I peeled out of there, leaving a smear. As I was driving home, my heart was pounding out of my chest. I've never had anything like that happen to me. 2 weeks later, a girl I was friends with on Instagram posted an article about multiple abductions in the Westchester area. I immediately thought back to that man in the truck. I'm thankful that I was able to escape. I almost became a statistic that night. This was in the mid-2000s, when I was in about the 2nd or 3rd grade. I lived in the rural Midwest and went to a decent-sized elementary school. For a few weeks, a friend of mine that I chatted with often was absent from school. I was confused and curious as to why he hadn't been attending for so many days in a row. I soon found out from the other kids that he was taking some time to rest and recover after a very traumatic experience in his family. I'm not going to reveal names, as for one, I don't remember the boy's name, and I also don't want to reveal any personal info about these people. For the sake of easier reading, I'll call the boy Mike. The standard chats and the occasional gossip I'd share with friends on the playground and in the cafeteria took a very dark turn once word got out of why Mike was absent. You see, one day, a friend of mine who we'll call Chad told us that Mike's mother had been murdered. I learned that this horrible act was carried out by the boyfriend of Mike's sister. The killer had snuck into the bedroom of his girlfriend's mother and either stabbed her to death or slit her throat in her sleep. I don't remember the exact details. I was only 9 or 10 years old, so hearing this was especially shocking. Having something like that happen so close to me was something I never imagined possible. According to Chad, the mother didn't want her daughter's relationship to get intimate until she and her boyfriend were married. She also didn't want them to get married until they'd been together a few years. She had gotten to know the guy well enough to know he would not treat her daughter well. Well, the sister's boyfriend was furious at this and believed the best way to get what he wanted would be to eliminate what he saw as a roadblock. I was disgusted and disturbed at such a pathetic and creepy move. The so-called man murdered an innocent woman just because he wanted to be intimate with her daughter. He was actually delusional enough to believe she would just go along with him after he carried out that gruesome act. I remember one day on the way back home from school, my mom pointed out that the funeral procession was happening around the neighborhood we lived in. It honestly surprised me that this all took place so close to where we lived. I remember seeing Mike in his black suit and tie, a very somber and serious look on his face. At school, I remembered him being a pretty easygoing and cheerful boy who enjoyed having fun and cracking jokes with me. Seeing him like this hurt. I can only imagine how this terror affected him, or like this seems like it would stay with you. I don't even remember if Mike ever came back to school for the rest of the semester, or if he didn't do so. I have no idea. I don't know what I would have even said to him if he did. What the hell can you say to someone who just had their life so cruelly changed at a young age? What do you say to someone whose mother was just taken from them by a heartless monster? Something about my memory of this being hazy unnerves me. I wonder if being hit with this cold reality at such a young age influenced my often cynical outlook on the world. I hope Mike and his family are doing well now, because no one deserves to have to go through that. This happened during the summer of 2021 in California. We were out and about in our city, running some errands and enjoying the summer weather. We realized that we needed to grab a few things for dinner that night, so we stopped by a Trader Joe's to shop. As I pulled my car up, we started to exit when a second car pulled in right next to mine. I happened to look over my shoulder and see a black man in what looked to be his late 50s. He had a look of pure anger on his face. He called me over to him. I approached the car to see what was going on. I figured it was still daylight, around 7 o'clock that night, and we were in front of the store where other people were around. What's the worst that could really happen? I walked over and the man was smoking a cigarette, still menacingly glaring at me. "Thank you for not ignoring me," the man growled. I remained calm but was already on edge. "What's up, man?" I asked him. The man took another drag of cigarette, and I noticed his knuckles were bleeding. This guy had clearly busted them on either a wall or someone's face, and based on how aggressive he was being towards me, I suspected it was the latter. "I'm really pissed off," he said, as if I couldn't already tell. "My daughter just got the shit beat out of her, and I'm trying to get out to her." I didn't know what to say other than, "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that." I'm ashamed to admit that I was getting scared both for my fiancée and myself. The man locked eyes with me. "Yeah, so I need some money," he growled again. "I'm not a bum, I'm not a bad guy, I just need some money to get to my daughter, okay? And you're gonna help me." I couldn't help but look down and see that he'd kept his hand under his seat. I'd seen this move before in movies and TV shows. There was a high chance that this man had some kind of gun or other weapon on him and was either going to rob us, shoot us, or both. I was panicking on the inside and only said, "Yeah, man, sure, let me go inside and get some cash." You may call me an idiot for that, but I was trying to think of a way to get out of the situation without setting this obviously unstable guy off. My fiancée looked at me and asked what was going on. As I walked back to the front of the car, I didn't answer her. I then contemplated what would happen if we went to the next store. He was parked next to my car and still staring at us. I couldn't come out empty-handed or call the police and risk them not coming on time, or at all for that matter. I knew I had one shot at making a move. I told my fiancée to get back in the car and I would explain later. I walked to my driver's seat. The man then looked at me again. "You going to get me some money?" he demanded. I nodded my head. "Yeah, man, just wait here. I'll be right back." Thank God he believed my story and didn't follow us out. I got in the car and immediately drove away. My fiancée looked over at me again and asked me what was going on. I told her what happened and that we needed to go to a different store for our groceries. My fiancée was completely understanding and supportive. I have a history of severe anxiety, and I was completely caught off guard by that situation. Needless to say, I took multiple back roads to the Trader Joe's in our neighborhood. I was on edge for the rest of the night, and also paranoid about the man following us or finding my car somehow. Let this be a lesson to all of you out there. I don't care how big and tough you think you are. Never approach a stranger's car at all. I'm a pretty tall and muscular guy, and this was scary even for me. I went out one evening to do a little shopping and ended up experiencing something truly unique and terrifying. I went to a place in Saitama. It's only about an hour away from my place by bike. I don't mean push bike, by the way. I ride a motorcycle. It seemed like a great evening to head on out, as there was this stillness in the air. No wind, hadn't rained that day, and it didn't look like it was about to either. As far as I was concerned, conditions were really perfect for a ride. The only problem was I had never been to Kawagoe before, so I got a little lost along the way. I say lost, but I was in the city, so I don't mean I was stuck in the middle of nowhere or anything. I had a rough idea of where I should be going because of all the signs and stuff, and I wasn't in too much of a rush. I was just happy to be someplace new. After about 10 minutes of riding around the city, I ended up turning down a one-lane road. Cars were barely able to pass by each other. It seemed like it was kind of a traffic loophole used by the locals, a shortcut. There was traffic though. I would say there was 10 cars ahead of me. Even though I was on a bike, I thought there wasn't enough room to chance it by trying to skip ahead. In the middle of this traffic lineup was a delivery truck. For some reason, I noticed it immediately, before any of the following events took place. Anyway, the light turned green, and the traffic began to move. It seemed like the intervals between green lights, amber, and red were pretty short, so everyone moved quite quickly. The truck, however, didn't move at all. I was stuck behind it, so I just sat there on my bike a little bit confused. I was not that interested, to be honest, though. The car behind me didn't honk its horn, so I thought there was no point trying to chase the truck driver off either. I really hated it when people honked their horns. After the light changed, we still waited, and we didn't move until the light turned red again. We didn't move at all. I just want to say that there was space for 4 other cars ahead of this truck. What was the holdup here? I wondered if this guy was out making a delivery, and that was why the truck was stalled. It seemed super insensitive and idiotic to leave it smack dab in the middle of a 1-lane road, though. Why not just park it somewhere else? Or put on the hazards or something at least. I didn't care if he was delivering something. I couldn't sit here and wait through multiple green lights. I thought, screw this. I pulled out from behind in an attempt to overtake it. I wondered if I'd get a look at the guy who was holding things up, or at least confirm that he was making a delivery. As I passed by, I was curious. I took a look into the driver's side window. I heard myself say aloud, "What the fuck?" It came out involuntarily. I pulled my bike to a stop, as the shock almost made me lose control. The guy inside was dead. I didn't even think there would be someone sat in the driver's seat, but here I was looking at a man's dead body. His hands were gripping the steering wheel still, and his head was towards the dashboard, just next to the wheel. His face was facing my way, slightly leaning against the steering wheel. I'll never forget the look on his face. His eyes were dead, rolled back slightly, revealing the whites of them. They were tinged red from the veins. My mouth was open. The man's tongue was visible. His open mouth was protruded toward me. I didn't see any obvious signs of trauma, blood, or bruising. His truck didn't show any damage either. Whatever happened to him to kill him likely happened very quickly. I thought he must have had a heart attack or something. I never dreamed I would see anything like that on the streets in real life. It really set my head spinning. I couldn't compose myself for a couple of seconds. Eventually, I snapped out of it and put my mind into action. I needed to inform everyone behind me that this guy wasn't going to be moving anytime soon. I also needed to inform emergency services. I pulled my bike over as much as I could and kicked out the stand. I went about taking my helmet off and heading back to the truck to find the name of this poor guy. I stopped in my tracks and saw something I couldn't believe. I thought I'd lost my mind. The truck roared to life and began to pull forward as if nothing had happened. I ran towards the truck just in time to see the driver's face through the windshield. All of a sudden, it looked like he was perfectly fine again. I didn't know what the hell was going on. His expression was cheerful and full of life. He left me standing there dumbfounded by the side of the road. I couldn't understand what just happened. One thing is for certain, that guy was definitely 100% dead. I can't get his face out of my head no matter how hard I try. Another thing I've thought about is why didn't any of the other drivers seem to care that they were being held up, or even react when the driver drove off? Was this some kind of weird glitch in the Matrix or something? I don't know, but it was really strange and creepy. This happened about 15 years ago. I was 21 years old and living in my very first apartment. It was a small bachelor apartment in a sketchy area. I grew up in a town that was known to be rough and tough, and I knew how to handle myself. I learned at a young age to keep my head down and not go looking for trouble. My apartment building was behind a bar. A lot of the patrons of the bar would stand outside and smoke. When they did this, they would be facing my apartment. Most of the smokers would just keep to themselves, but a few would say hello if I passed by. I never really had any issues until this one evening. That night I came home from work. I passed by the bar and saw this extremely tall man outside smoking. As I passed by, he glared daggers at me, and I gave him a slight nod. He acknowledged me and continued staring at me. It made me uncomfortable. I didn't really think much of it though. About an hour later, I got a sudden knock at my door. It was odd because you have to buzz people into the building. The complex only had 8 units, and I didn't know any of my neighbors. I froze because I didn't really want to talk to anyone. The knocking continued nonetheless. I shouted out, "Who is it?" A voice on the other side replied, "It's Tom." I don't know anyone named Tom. I think you must have the wrong apartment. The voice then said this, "You don't know me, but I know you. Open up so we can talk." I walked over to the peephole and saw it was the tall man from outside the bar. I yelled out again, "Fuck off or I'm calling the cops." I heard him walking away and heard the exit door opening and closing. He was gone, or so I thought. A few minutes later, I peeked out the window and saw that the tall man was standing in the parking lot. He appeared to be talking to himself. At this point, I was freaking out. I called up my landlord who lived in the building next to me. He told me to call the police, and in the meantime, he and his brother would go check things out. I called the cops and told them what was going on. They said they would send out a car. My landlord and his brother made their way to the parking lot. I watched from out my window and saw them approach the man. He took a single look at them and took off running. My landlord and his brother tried chasing the man down, but he got away easily. 5 minutes later, the police arrived, and I gave my version of events, as well as a description of the man. The officer stared at me for a moment. "It's a good thing you didn't answer that door, ma'am. We've had reports come in of a man matching that description, attacking women lately." A few days later, I got a call from the officer. He told me that as a part of their investigation, they were talking to the owner of the bar. The owner informed them that the tall man had appeared there, and the police responded and arrested him. I'm a 36-year-old woman, and I wish this wasn't real. Let me start off by saying it's crazy how children are so trusting. Maybe it's just me. When I was 7 years old, my parents and I were living in a basement apartment in the Bronx. The way the apartment was set up had my mother and father's room at one end of a short hall. The bathroom was in the middle and my room was at the other end. If you don't know anything about a basement apartment, just know that it doesn't take much effort at all to enter one. You can easily get in through a window. One very early morning, possibly around 7 or 8, I suddenly felt an intense pain in my buttocks. I got up thinking our cat had gotten into my room and scratched me or bitten me, as she used to nip hard and attack whenever she felt like it. I jumped up, looking for her, only to see a grown man sitting on my bed. I remember being really upset and asking him why he'd pinched me. He hushed me and said something about being thirsty. I remember pulling down my nightgown to cover my butt and asking him if he wanted juice or water. I wasn't scared at all, more surprised and mad that this man had pinched me. He said he wanted some juice. I left my room and closed my door, with this random stranger still sitting on my bed. I walked to the kitchen and grabbed some juice. As I was bringing the cup back to my room, I looked over at my parents' door. I thought I should wake them up, but I can't remember why. I decided against it. I ended up giving the man the cup, and he drank the juice. I remember he asked me if I could help him find his friend, and told me that he was lost. I remembered my dad had told me I wasn't allowed to go outside without him or my mother. They were worried, as this was a new neighborhood, and we had only moved in 2 weeks earlier. I remember being scared to go outside because I didn't want my parents to be upset with me. I told the man I had to wake up my parents and ask them. I remember he said it would be real quick because he knew his friend was somewhere in the area and it would be perfectly fine. We would find him quickly. I once again said no and told him I was not allowed to go outside without my parents. He ended up saying he didn't need my help anymore and that he would find them on his own. He asked me to lock the door behind him. I walked him out to the front door, waving goodbye. I tried to go back to sleep, but it was too late. I was wide awake, so I started watching cartoons. Well, the volume happened to be much louder than expected because my mother woke up and asked me very angrily why I was awake so early. I told her about the man who'd pinched my butt. At first, she didn't believe me, as she thought I'd had a bad dream. She lifted up my nightgown, though, and I guess I must have had a bad bruise. I'll never forget how she suddenly got so calm and started smiling at me with a very sweet voice, asking me what he looked like. She asked what happened, too, and if I remembered what he was wearing. I told her, and she left my room for a moment, coming back with my dad. She told me to tell him everything as well, using that same sweet voice. I didn't think that I was in trouble or anything. I thought I had made a new friend. After telling them about this new friend, they got dressed and started searching. Well, it didn't take long to find him at all, because he happened to be the superintendent's family member. When I saw him, I immediately shouted at him, "Hey, friend!" My parents told me to go back inside, which I did. An hour or so later, my parents came back with some McDonald's for me. They seemed angry, though. Before the end of that day, my father put a padlock on my door and told me that whenever I went to sleep, I should always lock my door, as our kitchen windows didn't lock. I guess that's how the man got in. Sometime later, when I was 15, I found out the guy was actually mentally ill and was sent away from the Dominican Republic by his family, so he wouldn't get arrested for something he'd done out there with another little girl. It still surprises me that I wasn't scared in the moment. If you or anyone you know lives in a basement ground-level apartment or a flat, please triple-check that all the window locks work, and always lock your windows as well. This happened around 2019. I'm happy to say that I'm a 25-year-old woman, but at the time this took place, I was 19 years old. A little backstory. I live in Queens, New York, in a very populated area. I always used to have to walk from my house to the gym and blasted music on my headphones all the time. It was a 45-minute walk, and I was never really scared of it. I used to do it all the time. Besides, there was so many people around. What was the worst that could really happen? Well, that's what I used to think at least. Anyway, on to the story. I was on my way back home from the gym on this night when for some reason I heard the voice in the back of my head turning me to turn back. It was telling me that I was in danger over and over. I had my headphones in, and I decided I needed to listen to my surroundings. I completely silenced my music and decided to look behind me. I had seen a white man with a blue t-shirt and dark jeans. I honestly don't know how to explain this, but the look he had while he was staring at me from behind, it wasn't a perverted look, but more of a psychopathic one. I really don't know how to explain. It wasn't like something suggestive or flirty. Besides, even if it was, I would never put myself in that situation. After that, I noticed the man was following me. Every time I stopped, he stopped as well. Every time I walked, he walked too. He was like that for a good 4 blocks. That is, until I saw a fire hydrant and decided to sit on top of it and smoke a cigarette. I wanted to think and relax and see if the man would pass me by. Turns out he didn't. With me being so stressed out, I had never paid attention to the store in front of me. It had a clear glass door, and there was a guy inside speaking to someone on the phone. Please remember him. This is really important in the story. I threw my cigarette and decided to go into this grocery store, then get a bottle of water, just so the store attendant wouldn't think I was weird or something. I went and grabbed the water bottle and paid the store attendant. As soon as he saw me, he noticed my face and that I was in distress. Mind you, my hands were shaking as I handed the cash to the clerk. I mean, who knows what this freak wanted to do to me? The store clerk asked me what was wrong, and I told him this weird guy was following me. He asked me who it was, so he could check the cameras. Lo and behold, the psycho was outside, standing next to the door and out of sight. Maybe a minute passed by. Remember when I said the door had a clear glass door? The next thing I know, he'd pressed his face right up against it, with both of his hands cupped. We made eye contact, but his stare was not normal. Never have I dreaded something so much in my life. My heart immediately dropped into my stomach. I felt like I wanted to vomit, in all seriousness. Thank God the guy never entered the store. I stayed in the store for about 15 to 20 minutes. The store clerk then told me he was gone, and I was safe now. I was so scared to go outside, though. I still had a 15-minute walk home, and who knew if he'd just crossed the street and was waiting for me or something. I opened the door and looked from left to right, and across the street. I had 1 foot in the store, and 1 foot out the door. I honestly didn't even want to leave at that point. Well, remember when I said there was this guy that was on the phone? Well, he wasn't on the phone anymore. He had his bike next to him, and he'd also noticed my face and how scared I was. I was honestly shitting bricks at this point. The man asked me what was wrong. I told him this weird guy was following me, and I was really scared. He asked me who the guy was. He then went on to describe exactly what the guy looked like, and asked if it was him. I immediately told him yes, and asked him how he knew. What he said next gave me even bigger chills. He said that he'd seen him outside the store, and the man had asked him if he'd seen his girlfriend that went inside. He also said that he was standing around for a good 20 minutes. I had never felt so scared in my life. If I told you before that my heart dropped into my stomach, well, this time I almost shit it out. Thankfully, the guy offered to walk me home safely. At the time, he was my guardian angel and blessing. He walked with me the whole 15 minutes, and I'm very thankful for his help. I don't know if this is scary to most of you, but it definitely was with me. My advice to all of you is to always trust that voice you hear in your head, and trust your gut instinct as well. When I was a little girl, my family lived in the bad part of the neighborhood. Many would refer to this as the ghetto, and I would agree. There are many things I could talk about, but I'm going to talk about an incident that happened to my mom. I was 5 years old, and my brother was around 3. My mom was feeding my baby sister when she heard a banging on the door. I later found out that it was someone kicking it. It was getting close to dinner time, so my mom wasn't expecting anyone. The only person she knew would be home soon would be our dad. Why would our own father knock on his own door? She went over to look out the window that was next to the door, and she saw a teenager standing there. My mom had seen this teen living in our area with his mother. The guy kept looking back at the driveway and talking to someone. My mom knew this looked sketchy, and knowing that she had 3 small children, one of whom she was holding, she waited to see what would happen. He banged once again on the door and then continued talking to someone. My mom was trying to keep us kids quiet so the dude wouldn't know that we were home. When he tried to kick the door again, my mom took her fist and banged on the door as hard as she could. It turns out there were 4 or 5 guys, that were hiding in our front yard. She had realized that when she banged on the door. She had scared the guy, and he took off running with his friends, them all coming out of their hiding places. She soon called the cops and told them what happened. I don't really remember if they ever got arrested or not. My dad later told me that he saw those same two boys trying it again, and he chased them away. I'm 21 years old now, and I still thank God he gave me a brave mother who would protect her children from harm. For anyone out there who's living in a scary area, either please get out of there, or if you can't, use your Second Amendment to keep yourself and your loved ones safe. I was driving me and two of my friends to their house, and we stopped right next to this car at a stoplight. We were in the left turn lane, and the car next to us was going straight. Well, I happened to look over and saw that there was nobody driving this car. Mind you, this was before the days of self-driving cars and Google Maps and all that. I was shocked and puzzled and didn't say anything. I thought I was just seeing things, or perhaps even going nuts. Finally, one of my boys piped up, "Are you guys seeing this car next to us?" or something to that effect. We all did see it. What the hell was going on here? We were all excited, confused, and also relieved that we weren't the only ones witnessing this ghost car. The light turned green. We made our left turn, and to our surprise, the car began driving by itself and went straight ahead. I turned right on the next road, and we ended up driving past that same car once more. This time, it was stopped at a stop sign, so we got a clear front view of it. There was nobody inside at all. One of the creepiest moments of my entire life. A story I've suddenly remembered from long ago, when I was probably 3 years old. One of my earliest memories. I remember my dad took me to the park one day. On the way there, we passed by those openings between where the road ends and the sidewalk begins, probably for draining excess rainwater. I was pretty bored, so I crouched down and tried to look into it. To my astonishment, I saw someone's face smiling at me from inside. Being 3 years old, I didn't really think anything of it. In fact, I found it somewhat funny, so I laughed and waved back to this person. They moved around for a bit, cocking their head, and then slipped away out of sight. Thinking they were done with me, I got up and moved along. Naturally, my dad was curious as to what I saw. I told him exactly. "There's a man that lives in there." He ignored it, not taking me, the 3-year-old, too seriously. Maybe I only imagined it, but that would have been tantamount to a serious hallucination, which I've never had a history of. Kids in my town used to swim at the local reservoir all the time, from early spring to early in the fall. It was on what we called the Old Airport Road, a deserted, forested stretch of dirt road that eventually led to a small airport in my area, hence the name. There was a rocky cliff area that some kids would be dared to jump off from, and sometimes my friends and I would have water balloon fights from the top of there, pelting the ones down below in the water. The water was always clean and pretty cold. It was overall just a pretty and quiet spot to enjoy your time in the water. It all changed one day, however, when the bodies were found. The story goes that a family from a neighboring town had gone to the reservoir after hearing about how nice it was, and decided to have a picnic and swim around for a while. For a little bit, everything was okay. The kids had gone around a bend in the reservoir, and the parents still heard the sounds of them playing, so they thought everything would be okay, and that they'd see them in just a minute. Then things suddenly went quiet. I mean real quiet, too. The type where even the birds stop chirping in the trees because there's something dangerous nearby. The parents obviously grew concerned and went poking around the top of the rock ledges to check on their kids. 2 little boys, 7 and 5. That's when they found their boys poking at something with a big stick just on the water's edge. Something bloated, distended, purple, and wearing a bright red hoodie. It was the body of a young girl, just floating there in the reservoir. She looked pale, and her eyes were bulging from her head. Her parents yelled at them to get away from the body and come there right this minute. The family members were interviewed, which is how we know this, especially the accounts from the children. The K-9 units were quickly dispatched as well. They combed through every inch of the surrounding reservoir, but the dogs couldn't pick up any scent other than this girl's. She was labeled a Jane Doe. No family or friends seemed to be looking for her, and the case went cold only a few months in. What little we do know is that she died of strangulation, not blunt head trauma like the family thought, and it's likely she had been sexually assaulted beforehand. Now, kids don't really go to that reservoir anymore, out of fear. Fear that we'll find another body just like that girl's. Fear they might become another casualty on the water for another family innocently enjoying the scenery to find. The killer is obviously still out there somewhere. Maybe he moved on. Maybe he decided to only kill once and that was enough for him. Maybe he's still out there, living a normal life along the old airport road. I don't know if we're ever going to find out who did this. My friend, we'll call her Kay's family, was always more well-off than most, with enough disposable income to buy some very luxury items. New cars, the latest gadgets or technology, even a full party boat. It's that party boat and my first experience out on the water that I'd like to focus on today. That boat was a real nice one. Cherry red with a single sparkle in the paint, with a built-in sun cover and comfortable seats situated in a ring around the deck. Although it was relatively small, it was enough for a group of teens to go out on the local lake and party one night. Long story short, Kay had just gotten her driver's license. One night, she called me and a few of our friends and classmates up, got in the truck with the boat attached, and drove off while her parents were out of the house. Yeah, she basically stole that boat. Some hearing this will condemn those actions, and maybe some won't. I just felt it was an important thing to mention. The group consisted of Kay, myself, our friend Jake, and his older brother Clayton. Now, Clayton was 20 at the time, and in his sophomore year of college. The rest of us were all between 17 and 18. Kay had had a huge but silent crush on him for quite a while. We all knew he would probably never reciprocate her feelings, but that didn't stop her from trying or dropping hints constantly. I think inviting him to a stolen boat party out on a lake at night with underage drinking was definitely her biggest one. It took some finagling to set everything up and get the boat going in the water, as she'd only seen her dad do this once or twice. Once we did, Clayton took over driving, as he was the oldest and therefore the most responsible. I say that with a huge grain of salt, as he had just as much idea of how to drive a boat as the rest of us. We did a few circles on the lake. The wind was frigid as it whipped past us. Kay and I cuddled together for warmth, with Jake telling his brother to slow down a bit. We were obviously making a lot of noise. It was hard to hear anything, as the darkness around us slipped by, slick as oil. It was impossible to tell where the ground was in the darkness, where the sky ended and the water began. Clayton laughed, and I'm pretty sure he said something, but his voice was very muffled by the wind. He had already had a couple of cans of beer while we were fumbling setting up the boat too, so he wasn't in the clearest state of mind. Kay turned to me and whispered in my ear, "Hey, I'm gonna try to kiss him later. Her eyes were bright with drunkenness. She'd taken up on the beer already as well, after she saw him doing it. Most likely she wanted to impress him and show him how mature she was. I was going to tell her I didn't think that was a good idea. I mean, he was in college and it would be kind of weird, right? But I didn't even have time to finish that thought. There was a jolt and a shuddering, scraping sound that vibrated the floor beneath our feet. Suddenly, we were launched from the boat into the cold, dark water. The boat had slammed hard into some rocks that were jutting out at a very high speed, and it had completely flipped over. I was flung out a fair bit, but I later learned the boat had collapsed right on top of Clayton. Kay had been launched right into one of the rocks and broke her arm, but still managed to crawl her way to safety since she landed not far away from the shore. In hindsight, that's partially what made us crash in the first place. Jake was yelling, and I saw the faint outline of his back as he dove under to look for his brother. Each time he came up empty-handed. Dizzy, with my head fuzzing over from the impact, I swam over to help him look. I just remember him yelling over and over until his voice was completely strained. "Clay? Clay, can you hear me?" I dove under, groping at rocks and weeds and everything I could find until I had to come up for air. At the last second, my fingers brushed what I thought was the front of a shirt. Attached to an arm, attached to a body, I burst out of the water, screaming to Jake, "I got him! He's right here!" I dove back under. Together, we managed to get him to the shore where Kay was waiting, holding on to her broken arm. As she moved it around, I could tell it was flopping over in a way arms never should. Jake told us to call 911. He slapped his brother in the face, trying to get him to wake up. "How the fuck do you do CPR?" he said. "We can't," Kay blurted, wincing in pain. "I mean, we drank beer. I stole the boat." "Kay," I said. I took her face in my hands, forcing her to look at me. I could see the whites of her eyes. She was clearly crying. "We have to call. Come on." She nodded and grabbed me with her good arm. She cried as she dialed 911 in my arms. The police and ambulance came 15 minutes later. They took Clay away on a stretcher. Miraculously, he still had a faint pulse, but it was not looking good. Jake went with him in the ambulance while the cops drove me and Kay home. They lectured us on underage drinking and driving a boat recklessly. Kay's parents had gotten home earlier than expected, and they were waiting for Kay when she got back. When the cops explained to them what had happened, they didn't yell at Kay like I thought they were going to. Instead, they just hugged her and I tight and made us promise to never do something like that again. We were offered towels, a shower, and a change of clothes while waiting for my dad to pick me up. I felt numb and cold, even after a hot shower. Kay still cried beside me, begging Clayton to be okay. She really blamed herself for the whole thing. Although Clayton did live, he was never the same again. He had difficulty speaking and remembering things, and he couldn't really move without a walker or a wheelchair. His brain had been without oxygen too long to make a full recovery. Kay, Jake, and I visited him a lot these few months in the hospital, and although he couldn't remember our names sometimes, he wrote down on a piece of paper in his shaky handwriting that it was okay. He still lives with his parents and needs constant care. As for me, Jake, and Kay, we're doing all right. Last time I spoke with Kay, she went off to college in another state, where she could escape from that terrible night. Jake stayed in the area to help care for Clay, and he and I actually became a couple many years later. We now have a daughter together, and we've talked a lot about that night. We're going to make sure to educate her on boat safety and how it's a very, very bad idea to go out on the water and not tell anyone where you're going. That it's exactly what happened to Uncle Clay. I really hope she listens to our advice. I'll start by saying that I'm deathly terrified of water. Any large, deep body of water, I refuse to go near it. Hell no. My wife finally convinced me to go to counseling after suffering through a lot of beach and pool trips with no swimming and not knowing why. That was part of the joke. She was actually really concerned about my well-being and why I wasn't opening up to her about it. When I finally did, she brought up counseling every day until I would go. My therapist recommended I journal my thoughts and open up to others about my fears so I could conquer them. After some soul-searching, I can trace my crushing fear of water to the old swim instructor I had when I was still in kindergarten. His name was Mark. He was in his early 20s from what I can remember, and was extremely fit. With the physique of someone who swam every day, he was extremely energetic with us kids, and unfortunately also very critical as well. He expected little 2 to 5-year-olds swimming for the first time to jump right into the deep end, so to speak. He wanted us to be able to swim as well as he did after only a single lesson or two. My first lesson, the one my mom was present for, went about as well as you'd expect. He was very patient, nice, and helpful. He even guided me across the shallower parts of the lake and held me up as I tried and failed to kick. I forgot to mention, instead of traditional lessons at a swimming pool, Mark offered them over the summer at a lake in my town. The lake was so wide you could just barely see the other side over the horizon, and the water ranged from blue to a dark muddy black on most days. There was a dock and a little strip of beach that I could play on after my lesson was over. That was if my mom wasn't tired after working. Some parts of the lake bottom were very rocky though. I remember getting out of the water a lot to find small scrapes and cuts on my feet after stepping on a few sharp rocks. Mark didn't care though, at least not when we were alone. He would just tell me to go back in the water, sometimes even pushing me in, causing me to trip and get scraped up even more. The worst part though was when he made me swim out deeper than I was comfortable with. If I started to get scared, he would call me a wuss or a baby, and things like that. He would keep on pushing me until I made it to whatever arbitrary point he'd set for that lesson. I'd get so tired from all that swimming. My mom said I used to fall asleep in the car after every lesson and had to be carried inside because my legs and arms were too strained to move. Mark would also tell me scary stories too. Ones about monsters hiding at the bottom of the lake with teeth and claws that would snatch up kids who were bad at swimming or too slow to escape them. I hated it. Every time he made me go out deep, I would picture gnashing teeth grasping at my legs from below and trying to pull me under, just like he'd said. I cried whenever I couldn't feel anything below me or see anything in the dark water. I guess it all came to a head one day, and after this experience, I never had swimming lessons with Mark again. Or anyone for that matter. It was a cloudy day on a Wednesday, and I was dreading going out into the water when it would be most dark, almost an oily black. I really couldn't see anything, and I knew Mark was going to be mean about it. I don't really know why I didn't tell my mom about any of this. I guess I didn't want to disappoint her, since I was the one who begged to learn how to swim in the first place. Mark was waiting for me as usual, already in his swim shorts. As soon as I got out of the car though, he immediately flashed me an angry look. He looked madder than I'd ever seen him before, and I could feel something drop in the pit of my stomach. Even back then, I knew something was wrong. I had on a neon pink swimsuit at the time with bright blue flowers, and Mark had noticed. He flatly, even with an intense look in his eyes, said, "You know, the fish people are gonna see that easily. Maybe you should take it off." My heart just about stopped. I had just covered safety in kindergarten that week, and what to do and look out for if an adult in your life said something exactly like that. And boy, if that wasn't a get an adult you trust right away moment, I don't know what is. Just as quickly as the panic spiked, it settled though, when he said, "I'm just kidding, go take a lap." He put his hands up defensively, as if seeing the recognition in my eyes. The lake was really cold that day, and stretched on forever in that waving black expanse. I stepped out carefully on my shaking legs, wanting to get away from Mark, while also terrified about going out there. When I was about waist high, I started swimming. He usually made me go to the buoys separating the deeper parts of the lake from the shallow part, so I thought I could hang there for a minute with the excuse of catching my breath. He would be annoyed, of course, but since he couldn't reach me from the shore, I'd be okay. I turned out to not be okay. The buoys were an orange beacon as I bobbed through the water. My arms were already feeling heavy and tired, but I pushed on. I could feel Mark stare on me all the while, and though I didn't look back until I got to them, I knew he would either be angry or disappointed that I was already out of breath. I reached them and clung onto one for support. Since it was so cool out, my hands were already clammy from being out of the water, and goosebumps started to make their appearance on my body. Aside from the few birds that flew overhead, I felt completely alone out there. I nearly had a little heart attack when something splashed beside me and a hand grabbed my shoulder. In reflex, I let go of the orange buoy and sank below the surface. The hand went with me, but instead of letting me go, it held me down. The muddy water stung my eyes. I couldn't see which way was up or down. I thrashed and tried to get away from this hand. My chest hurt, and I couldn't take it anymore. I gasped for air. My mouth quickly filled up with lake water, and I screamed. Blood was rushing hard in my ears, and I couldn't even hear myself thinking. The hand tugged me up suddenly, holding my head out of the water before plunging me back down again. I didn't even get a chance to breathe in. The hand did this several more times. I can only remember a blur of water after that. I thought to myself, this is it. Mark said they'd come for me, the monsters, and they did. And then, suddenly I was back on the shore, coughing and retching, trying to fill my lungs as fast as possible. I heaved myself over onto my stomach, and water rushed out of my throat onto the ground. Mark was standing over me, grabbing my back and slapping it, making sure all the water came out. The grip felt familiar, and as I calmed down and looked up at Mark, I understood why. Instead of concern or worry crossing his face, he was laughing, not even trying to hide it. I knew then it was never the lake monsters that had dragged me under. "Come on, take it easy, kid," he said, reining in his mocking laughter. "I knew you needed some motivation, but that was pathetic. You nearly drowned." He did this to me, all to motivate me to swim better, or to scare me. As a literal kindergartner who just almost drowned, I couldn't find the words to express what I was feeling at that moment. All I could do was burst into tears and cry until my lesson was over. Mark brought me my towel and didn't speak to me until my mom pulled into the parking lot above the beach. He leaned in close, and I could still smell his breath to this day, like he'd eaten something spicy for lunch. He whispered in a low voice, "Don't tell anyone, or next time I won't pull you back up. Do you understand, kid?" I didn't say anything. I just nodded and went to the car. Mark waved to my mom and smiled as I got in. She asked me how my lesson went, and paused when I just said good. She asked if I was okay, but I didn't say anything for a long while. I guess I was in shock after what just happened. Finally, I just said, "I hate swimming. I don't want to go anymore." And we never did. My mom pulled me out of those swimming lessons, and I never went to another trainer again. Hell, I didn't even touch the idea of swimming or going into any water after that, even public pools in the gym or otherwise. I just kept seeing Mark's face after he pushed me under the water, or feeling his hand on the back of my head, feeling my lungs still burning whenever I looked at a body of water bigger than a puddle. I've had my wife look over this, and she thinks it's sad and really well written. She hugged me for a long time after I finished writing it, and I'll thank her forever for urging me to go to therapy. I'm not on a complete road to recovery yet, but I know I'll get there someday with her support. I don't know where Mark is now or if he's still teaching kids, but I hope he had his head held underwater at least once, just so he'd know how it feels. The saying, blood is thicker than water, is a familiar one. It means your blood relatives or family unit should be your only loyalty, and giving them up for anything outside of it should be highly frowned upon. That being said, there's another phrase I can coin that means something more to me, associated with an event I'll never forget no matter how long I live. Blood is thicker than oil, both in the metaphorical and literal senses. It all started on the day my parents told me they were getting a divorce. We lived on a huge property by a lake at the time, in a huge log cabin-style house. They hosted parties every summer, with friends and neighbors out on the lake. There would be music, the smell of hot dogs and hamburgers on the grill, and the lake looming over the horizon, reflecting the firelight and whatever color of fireworks we chose that night. It was at one of those parties that my parents started acting really strange. They were usually on opposite schedules throughout the week, but on these weekend parties they reconnected, laughed, and danced with each other as if they were together 24/7. But that night they seemed to be on opposite sides every time I looked for them. Whenever I asked if they were going to dance tonight, my mom just straightened her mouth and didn't say anything. My dad would shrug and say he'd catch up with her later. At 13 years old, I knew something was off, but I couldn't think of anything to try and fix it. Different neighbors milled in and out of our house for water and snacks and to use the bathroom as the party went into the later hours. The breeze was still lukewarm, but eventually I had to go out to my room to get a jacket. Our house was very large, and my room was at the end of the hall at the right, on the side of the house that faced the lake. I passed a few people who smiled and waved as I went up the stairs, but aside from the top landing where the bathroom was, the upstairs was really quiet. I usually go inside once or twice to give myself a moment to breathe and decompress from these parties. I have sensory processing issues, and excessive chatter for too long makes me disassociate. That's definitely what I needed tonight. I was already feeling not all there from all the noise outside, and just needed 5 or 10 minutes. That's all. But 5 or 10 minutes was all it took for my life to change. I got to my room, shutting the door softly behind me, and taking a seat on my bed. I left the lights off because I felt particularly light-sensitive that day. I lay there in the dark for a few minutes, breathing and not thinking much about anything. The quiet felt like swallowing a spoonful of warm honey. It was really good and relaxing. My quiet moment was shattered, though, when I heard splashing through the open window. Not the regular kind of splashing either. Frantic, desperate splashing that sounded like a little kid had fallen in or something. My trance broken, I raced to the window to look out. I still felt disconnected to my surroundings, but I was there enough to be able to see what was going on. I almost didn't want to believe it. Down there in the dim glow of the moonlight and light from the bonfire around the corner, I saw my dad. He was bent over waist deep, wrestling with something. At first, I thought he was play wrestling with his brother or playing chicken or something. He was childish like that even at 40. But I quickly realized that wasn't the case when a man I knew popped out of the water, trying to punch my dad and get ashore. But my dad snatched him back and tackled him back in, pinning his head under again. It was Mr. Welsh, our next-door neighbor, a man we'd had at those parties every weekend. He and his wife often babysat me when my parents went out to dinner. He repaired our plumbing when I flushed Legos down the toilet. Everything neighborly you could think of, and there my dad was trying to drown him right in front of me. Not that he knew I was there, but I think he would have done this even if my bedroom light was on. I watched as they continued to struggle. When Mr. Welsh didn't come up for a minute and his body stopped moving, I couldn't take it anymore. I ran downstairs out the front door. People stopped to talk to me, all smiling, but I ignored them and ran past. I turned the corner of the house. My dad was there coming out of the lake, but Mr. Welsh was nowhere to be found. I looked frantically out at the water, but I couldn't see him anywhere. My dad just looked at me. His shoulders sagged. I could swear something broke inside him. He collapsed to the ground and sobbed into his hands, repeating the same thing over and over. "I fucking killed him. I killed him." My parents sat me down later and told me they were getting a divorce. The meeting was closely monitored, of course. The jail guards weren't going to let a kid near an alleged murderer alone, even if he was his son. I learned that apparently my mom had been having an affair with Mr. Welsh, one that lasted for years before my dad found out. He was devastated and confronted her a few days before the party. When she refused to leave Mr. Welsh and asked for a divorce, my dad took his rage out on the only thing he could think of, Mr. Welsh himself. He'd seen him talking and dancing with my mom at the party, and something inside him snapped. He asked Mr. Welsh down to the lake around the side of the house to look at the dock. When they were all alone, my father dragged him to the water. I still don't know how to feel about either of my parents. I was sent to live with my grandparents in another town as everything played out, and only saw them on supervised visits. I know I can't forgive my mom for what she did to my dad, but I also feel weird around my dad too, for the awful thing I saw him do. His anger was understandable, of course. It's what he did with it that makes me so unsettled. He's told me he still loves me a lot and will be there for me when he gets out. I believe him. I just don't know if I'm ready to accept everything yet. Mr. Welsh's body was never recovered. My dad was convicted purely on circumstantial evidence. Some days I think of driving out to the old lake house where I grew up, and my innocence was lost, and looking out at that great expanse of water. Maybe one day Mr. Welsh will finally be found in that lake, or maybe he never will. I work summers as a camp counselor in northern parts of Ontario, Canada. On the date this particular incident occurred, I was camping with a group of 10-year-old boys on the same lake the summer camp was based on. Like a routine camping trip, we canoed out to the site and set up our tents. Me and my coworker Mike took turns supervising the kids while we swam, built forts, and played games. We cooked some food over the fire, sat around, and told stories, cooked s'mores, the typical Canadian camping experience. At around 9:30, I tell the kids it's time for bed, and they head off into their tents, which were positioned a small walk away from the shoreline, but still within line of sight from where we had the fire pit. Me and Mike were shooting the breeze by the water, smoking a cigarette, and basically just hanging out, before we decided to head into our own tent and call it a night. What happened next still troubles me to this day, and remains my go-to scary campfire story. We were both gazing into the pitch-black night water, when we saw a small light approaching us slowly, slightly above water level. We speculated what this could possibly be for a few moments, before it came close enough for us to see. The light was mounted on the front of a kayak, and someone was approaching our campsite. Now, it's important to note that as a camp counselor, part of our training goes over how to deal with stranger encounters in an environment where we're responsible for a group of children on public property. I was prepared to give this mystery paddler the typical speech about how we were camping with a group from a recognized organization, and we would respectfully ask they find another campsite. This person's appearance shook us to the bone, though, as the light drew nearer. Paddling this kayak was a woman who looked to be in her 60s. She had incredibly long wisps of gray hair that was trailing off into the water. Her skin looked like old leather, and her dead-looking eyes were tough to spot underneath all her wrinkles. She looked directly at me, and she spoke. I realized she was missing most of her teeth. "Oh, are all the children safe in bed?" she asked me, pointing in the direction of the tents, not really knowing how to respond, and quite frankly crapping myself. I responded by telling her we were fine, and she had to leave. "That's good. Just as expected for this time." She smiled and then turned her kayak and paddled off into the night. At this point in time, myself and Mike were legitimately very creeped out. Not only because the appearance of this mystery woman, who resembled a corpse, But because of her inquiry on the whereabouts and safety of the children we had brought on this trip, not knowing what else to do, we grabbed our hunting knives and sat by the fire after checking on the kids once more. A half hour later is where things really started to get creepy. Across the lake, a female counselor was leading another trip for kids the same age group. She sent me a text which read something along the lines of, "Hey Sean, stop screwing with us. This isn't funny. My kids are really creeped out." I instantly called her and let her know I had just seen someone near my campsite that seemed eerie and suspicious, and I was not trying to play any jokes. Apparently, one of their kids had opened their tent door to take a piss and seen a woman with long hair standing with her arms open toward them near the shoreline. I live in the countryside in an idyllic village where half the houses are vacation homes. Not much happens here, but if you enjoy nature, it's a pretty great place to live. I'm an outdoorsy kind of woman, with my favorite element being water. I do kayaking, diving, swimming, anything water-related I can get my hands on. I was on my way home from my night shift. I had this job just for one summer at a halfway house. It's a home for 8 recovering addicts, and there has to always be 2 people working there at night, just in case. It's usually very calm. We play cards, watch TV, cook. It's pretty easy money. Back on topic, I was driving home, and as I always do, I stopped at the little secluded lake for a swim. I can never resist a good swim, and always got a bikini in the car just in case. This lake isn't very large, but it is crystal clear and surrounded by a beautiful forest. You would never even know it was there if no one told you. The little road that leads down to the beach is fairly narrow and well hidden. As a result, there's almost never anyone there, aside from the occasional dog walker. I had only just started to swim out into the lake when I felt that my car key, which I kept tied onto a piece of string around my ankle, didn't feel quite tight enough. I was afraid it would slip off and be lost in the water. Instead of swimming straight out into the lake, I quickly made my way around a little rocky part of the headland. This area was slightly L-shaped. I was in the angled portion and could see through to the beach and the car as I fastened the string better. I just so happened to look up towards my car. My spot was slightly hidden, not far from the beach or the car, behind the corner of this area. As I watched the car, I didn't notice him at first. I had to really squint to make sure what I was seeing wasn't an illusion or a trick of my imagination. But as I looked closer, I saw that squatting behind my SUV was clearly a man. A man in a bright yellow hoodie. I didn't see his face, of course, and it was too far away to actually see who this was anyway, but I recognized this person's hoodie. This guy must be Creepy Freddy. He was only 17, but he was very unstable. He'd never returned from his visit to his parents the day before. We called the police, of course, but since he usually turns up on his own after a few days of freedom and drugs, the police often advise us to just wait and see. He'd earned his nickname of Creepy Freddy after assaulting a girl for no other reason than that he felt she was too beautiful. Thankfully, she hadn't been injured badly, but it was still extremely creepy. Indeed, he had a very long history of drug-induced violent outbursts. Even if he was nice enough when he was sober, he was a nightmare when he wasn't. I thought about trying to get up, leaving the car behind, and trying to walk towards the main road. But what if he spotted me and chased after me? I had no idea if he was in a fit state or not. I was also barefoot in my orange bikini. I would be very easy to spot. I decided against the risk of enduring a face-to-face encounter with a possibly drugged up and possibly armed Freddy. That was too big a risk. I considered my other options, and I realized there was only really one. To swim across the lake and reach the little cluster of vacation cottages that occupied the opposite beach. As quietly as I could, I started to swim over. The swim took me over 90 minutes. I kept turning around to see if I was being followed. When I reached the other beach, I was completely exhausted and cold. I walked up the sandy beach as a young mom and her kids spotted me. I explained the situation and she phoned the police and fed me some scones and coffee and the best waffles I ever had. The police arrived only to find Freddie gone. All 4 of my tires had been slashed. I resigned from my job at the halfway house where he stayed soon after, and Freddie is, as far as I know, still not found to this day. For some background, I've grown up in South Africa my entire life and live in a generally safe area. Any medical professionals in South Africa, i.e. doctors, physios, etc., have to complete a year of community service where the government places you in a most likely rural area where you're expected to work in a public facility and help around the community. Being a medical professional, I moved to another province, equivalent to a state, in South Africa for a year to complete my aforementioned service. I won't mention the specific area, but it's considered more rural than the regular South Africa city. Needless to say, having not lived there for very long, I wasn't always sure which hangout spots were considered safe and which ones you'd much rather avoid. Fast forward a few months into living in this new province, my boyfriend came to visit me. We drove around and noticed a huge park enclosed by a fence nearby. There were tons of families walking around in the grass, having barbecues, sitting on benches. We thought it looked like a pretty safe area. We chose a spot on a bench and sat down together to talk. My boyfriend still lived back home, so we were doing the distance thing. I was sad he was going to be leaving again in just 2 days, and started crying because of this. That actually is relevant later. He calmed me down and we sat looking at all the people walking around. Next thing we know, these 2 guys started walking from about 20 meters away, heading right for us. They looked extremely sketchy too. All mismatched clothes which were torn up, and they were doing the typical gangster walk. We thought they might just walk past us, but they literally walked straight up to us. Being from South Africa, my boyfriend and I both had an immensely bad feeling about the encounter soon to come. They approached us. We froze in place instead of getting up and walking away. One of the gangsters, clearly covered in gang tattoos, crouched down next to me, while the other one went around to my boyfriend and stood behind him. They asked us if we could help them out with some money because they'd just gotten out of jail yesterday. We said we didn't have any, but they were persistent and wouldn't leave us alone. I was starting to freak out at this point. I'd been robbed before, and I knew this persistent behavior could and eventually would escalate to violence. They told us they didn't exactly want to hurt us, but they needed the money and whatever else we had to give or else. My boyfriend realized this too, and took out his brand new phone in hopes that would make them leave us alone. They took the phone and glanced it over a few times. The brand was not common in South Africa, and because they couldn't recognize it, they said they didn't want this. They moved in closer, behind us, crouching down. We assumed that so the other people around us wouldn't see them. I tried to hide my car keys in my pocket. I was scared they'd try to take the car, as they kept looking over at me. I didn't know what to do, and I was feeling overwhelmed, so I just started crying. I lied and told these gangsters that we just found out my boyfriend's dad passed away. Could they not see we were very upset? There was no way we'd be able to make it to his funeral if they took all our stuff from us. Luckily, as I said before, I had already been crying beforehand when they arrived, so it didn't seem like a lie at all. The one on my boyfriend's side's demeanor immediately changed. He apologized and gave his condolences. I was very surprised at this. The other gangster crouching beside me didn't seem to care though. He reached into his pocket. At this point, I was very sure something bad was about to happen. Likely, he would pull out a knife on me. I grabbed my boyfriend's hand, and we tried to run away. They just stood there watching us, and luckily didn't try to chase after. I guess they decided there were too many people around. For anyone wondering, South Africa's crime rate is extremely high, one of the highest in the world. And while most areas are safe, you can never escape running into situations like this. For anyone thinking we may have been prejudiced because they didn't technically do anything, I can promise you, when you see a South African gangster, you will know. They're known for being cold and ruthless, so I'm glad we made it out of there unharmed physically. I don't want to know what would have happened if we didn't get out when we did, or if they hadn't believed my lie. This story stretches over a couple of years, starting in my junior year of high school. I was a very sad teenager. My dad had recently declared he didn't love my mom anymore, and my parents had been fighting non-stop. My father became completely distant at the most crucial point of my development, so as a result, I developed attention issues. It was one of those usual, my dad doesn't pay attention to me, so I wanted everyone else to do that sort of things. Not going to lie, I wouldn't go as far as to blame myself for this situation because I was a minor, but I can't say I didn't want it when it first started. We met online, like it usually happens. He was attractive, very smart, a college student. He told me he was 20. I'm not sure if that's true or not, because apparently he told me a fake name also. I had turned 17 that summer. It was nearing March of my junior year, and we hit it off immediately. I liked him a lot actually, so nearly a week after us talking, we decided to meet up. He lived a couple of hours away from me, which he drove all the way through traffic just to meet me at school. That sounded sweet to me at the time, but now it just raises major red flags. I didn't really think much of our age difference because I was almost legal anyway, and I also thought of myself as very mature. It didn't bother me that this man was already almost out of college. He picked me up from school in his Prius. We hugged and decided to go to the mall to just hang out a bit. It was nearing sunset at this point. He bought me some ice cream and everything had gone pretty nicely. Everything changed when we went to his car though. He drove out to the empty side of the mall parking lot and asked if I wanted to make out in the back. I said sure, thinking it was no big deal. So we began kissing and I was really feeling it, you know. I was a horny teenager, I mean, what else would I be doing? Then though, something strange began to happen. He stopped in the middle and said, "Can I bite you?" I was taken aback for a moment. I was like, "What do you mean by bite?" "I don't know," he said. "I just get so turned on by pain. I love seeing people suffering." I was like, maybe he's into BDSM or something. I thought it was really strange, but maybe he just worded it poorly or something. Also, I didn't really want to be bitten though. A certain fear began to settle in. I felt nervous. I realized we were all alone, and this dude had just said something super unsettling. It was getting dark outside as well, and the doors were all locked. I felt myself backed into a corner. I legit thought to myself, if I say no, will he hurt me? I decided to say yes with much hesitation, but tried not to show it. I said he could bite me on the arm, but to stop when I said so. He said he would try, but no promises because he couldn't control himself. I was terrified. The man bit me so hard it looked like a zombie bite from one of those TV shows. He bit me right on the center of my forearm. It was dark purple, and he left teeth prints in my skin. I couldn't handle him biting me for such a long time, so I screamed in pain, at which point he removed his jaws from my arm, and it started to bleed. After that, he took me home. I was alarmed, but I just couldn't stop talking to him. I still talked with him for weeks after. He started to tell me all types of alarming information about him. He talked about being together and running away with each other because our parents wouldn't understand. He was a Muslim and I was a Christian. He got so weird though that we stopped talking for a while. He began to follow me on all my social media. I decided I wanted to block him after I realized just how toxic he was. There wasn't any particular occurrence as to which I stopped, or a final red flag. Basically, my best friend just talked some sense into me and bullied me into breaking it off with him. She was the smart one of us two, definitely. She convinced me he was a creep, and I agreed with her. I felt an immense amount of guilt. I pretty much forgot about him until my freshman year of college. What I hadn't been aware of this entire time, though, was he'd made a fake account to follow me on Twitter. I had already been in a relationship for about a year, and this one time, without even thinking about it, I decided to post a kind of racy picture on Twitter. I was 20 at this time. After a few minutes, I received a DM from a person I didn't know. I was like, who could this be? I could tell immediately it was him. The message read, "I finally got to see those beautiful Slav boobs of yours." I was grossed out to say the least. My boyfriend was all questions because I'd completely forgotten about this guy up until that moment. It still doesn't end there though. Fast forward a couple of weeks. I'm walking on my university campus, and guess who I see there, just sitting down on a random bench? Yeah, you guessed it. I was so done with this. Are you serious? The universe just seemed to want to fuck with me. He looked up with me and made eye contact, after which I received another Twitter message. I didn't even bother reading it. I thought I had blocked him on everything, but the fact we still somehow ended up attending the same university gave me chills. It's not that I knew he would do something to me, because I don't really know if I can say for sure he would. The unsettling fear was still there though. I was intensely paranoid. It all just seemed too convenient that he was going to the same college as me, years after he was supposed to have graduated. We talked about going to this university because he wanted to transfer, but he said he probably wouldn't because the drive was too far away from where he lived. And then seeing him there after he mentioned not wanting to attend it, it felt kind of crazy. The timing was just too good. After that, I saw him again several times, though I don't think he'd noticed I was there. I'd completely changed the way I looked by then. Dyed and cut my hair, switched to contact lenses instead of glasses. I hope he just didn't recognize me or stop paying attention, maybe even graduated. I'm not sure if this is as crazy as some other stories you've heard, but I definitely don't want to see that guy ever again. I used to work at Borders way back when, though I had another job at the mall as well. Something about being at the bookstore, though, made me much more recognizable, I guess. I often had people approach me when I was on the street, or ask me about the store's sales while I was at a drive-thru window. It was mostly harmless stuff, though I did get some creeps on occasion. At the time, I had a dating profile up, but I had to take it down. I'd started getting really weird messages from people saying they'd seen me at the grocery store or something. Just really bizarre crap. The killing blow that finally made me close it, however, came shortly before my 19th birthday. I was checking my account after work, and I see a message titled, "We've met," which really creeped me out immediately. I clicked on it, and it said, "Sort of." It proceeded to go into this very weird graphic depiction of this guy who was apparently so thrilled by my cashiering skills that I caused a stirring in his loins while checking him out. This email was seriously like 3 pages long, all talking about how sexually excited he was and all the things he wanted to do to my young body. It was in great detail. I was horrified to think that while I was just doing my job, one of my customers had been looking at me like that, thinking all these horrible things. I clicked on the profile, only to find there was no photo. It said he was 56 and single, but no other information. I needed to know what this guy looked like, which is the only reason I replied. I imagined that had been his game all along. I didn't respond to any of the other things he said, but I asked him if he'd send me a photo. He told me he couldn't do so because he was some sort of public figure. He told me he'd email it to me instead. It took him 2 days to get back to me. Those were 2 very long days. While I waited, I looked at my message history and discovered that this guy had actually written me many times. I just always ignored him because he had no pictures and was out of the age group I was looking for. Out of morbid curiosity, I looked through all these messages. All of them were of him seeing me at random places, describing the thoughts of sexually graphic things he wanted to do to me. He talked about fantasies of using me with another man he knew, raping me, tying me up. Many of the details were specific to me alone, which led me to believe he wasn't just mass sending these out to every young woman on the site. They were specifically about me. Meanwhile, this guy was older than my dad. I spent the next 2 days tensing around every older man who came in. I was afraid to be friendly with any of them. I was in fear that one of them would be this guy, and he'd take it as a go-ahead to come at me. I was having my birthday celebration, the day he finally got back to me. The moment I saw his name, I got a bad feeling in my gut. I couldn't immediately place it, but I knew there was something wrong with this person in particular writing these things to me. I stared at it for a moment, positive I knew this guy from somewhere. My brain just refused to click for some reason. I texted my friend to confirm with her as it began to dawn on me. This man had been my high school principal. I was horrified. I was still 18 at the time, which meant he must have been creeping on a bunch of us all along. I remembered many times of being alone with him in his office, and it made me feel queasy. Was he just perched there waiting for us girls to graduate so he could legally pounce on us? I wrote him back and told him, I don't know if you remember me, but you were my high school principal, and I happen to know you're married. He didn't reply. I thought that would be the end of it. I was still super creeped out for a while after that though, just knowing how long he'd been thinking about me and sending me these graphic messages. He'd been an authority figure in my formative years. Almost a year passed without further incident. He didn't come in when I was there. One day, I was ringing someone up without having gotten a good look at his face though. It was a friendly exchange, right up until I made eye contact. It was him again, grinning at me. I put his stuff in his bag and turned away from the register, but he stayed where he was. I pretended to organize some returns, but he just kept standing there, silently, not moving or saying anything. I knew he was watching me, but I couldn't bear to look. The moment lasted far too long. Finally, I grabbed my headset and asked a manager to come to the front of the store. He ran out after that, and I never saw him again. This first started when I went to a summer camp in my junior year of high school. I met this girl, whose name was Mar. I introduced myself to Mar. Then, for the rest of the 6 weeks, I talked to her probably a grand total of 3 times, which includes my introduction, the time she locked me and my friend in a room, and when I said goodbye when the camp ended. She seemed really nice, and I thought she was extremely sweet. Fast forward a year, I get a text out of nowhere saying, "Hey, I missed you. It's me, Mar." We continued to text, catching up on our lives. At the time, I thought this was fairly normal, as I'd usually get texts from people at that camp trying to catch up, and it was really nice hearing where they were in life. About 9 texts in, after catching up on everything, she suddenly asked me, "Would you go to prom with me?" I dismissed the strangeness because I thought she was probably desperate to get a date for prom. I was about an hour drive away, and that was a good distance. She let me know the date of her prom, which I realized was the day after my own, and the day before one of my concerts of an orchestra I was in at the time. I let her know of the complicated situation, but she continued to try and convince me to go with her. Every day, she texted me many times asking if I could go, saying that I had time, that I should do it for her. I said yes in the end. I felt like she really wanted a date to prom for the experience, so I thought, why not? I would want the same if I was in her situation. What could go wrong? 3 days later, I'm playing some games on my PC at the time, when I hear my older sister yell the darndest thing from downstairs. "Your girl is here!" Confused, I go to the window of my room, and what do you know? Mar is standing in my driveway, smiling and waving at me. Now, most people might have thought, oh my god, how did she find my address? How did she know I wasn't doing anything right now? What the fuck? Instead, my dumbass instantly thought, oh shit, she drove an hour to get here. I feel kind of bad. I headed outside to meet her and ask her why she was here. The first thing she said to me was, I drove an hour to get here, so you should take me out on a date. Behind me was my dad, approvingly shaking his head. Before I could even reply, he told me to go. He had such a proud look on his face. That's when I realized this situation might be kind of bad. I took her out to a Chinese restaurant and decided to order 3 plates of food all by myself. I realized that if I could keep eating, I could decrease the time I had to talk, as I'd be chewing 75% of it. To start off, she told me stories about all the guys she'd ever went after, who were taken by people she knew. She got increasingly mad, as she kept talking to the point where people around us started to look. She suddenly asked me about my relationship with a girl I'd had a thing with a few months back. In my head, I again thought this was fine. She probably knew about that girl because she was friends with her friends, and they probably told her about it. I explained my situation about how I don't talk to that girl anymore. Mar suddenly gets this flare in her eye. She asked me what I planned to do with the time until college, and if I was interested in dating. I told her I didn't really have any particular plans. After a few more places we go to, because she said she wouldn't leave until she was satisfied with her time with me, I went back home, and we decided to play games on my Wii. After a solid game of Super Smash Bros. Brawl, she realized I was not having much fun. I guess you're kicking me out then. She proceeded to try and kiss me. Out of panic, I put my entire right hand on her face and pushed her away. I led her out of my house and to her car. Once she got in, she started to take pictures of me on her Snapchat with the caption, "First date." I told my parents about the situation, and I swear to God, they literally brushed it off right away. Oh, people can be like that. You should be happy a girl likes you. My sister, though, started to figure out that maybe this was not good. She agreed with my parents, though, because she thought it would be funny to see how this all went. 2 weeks later of dodging all her texts of her asking to come over again, I'm heading to her pre-prom party. I was completely exhausted, to the point where I couldn't even run. I was not ready for another prom. Surprisingly though, the pre-prom party and the prom itself was a lot of fun. She didn't do anything that made me feel uncomfortable, and her friends were amazing. After the prom, she took me back to her friend's house. She then asked if I could stay the night, which I couldn't due to my concert the day after. She started to get very angry with me, so I texted my sister to help me. For the first time ever, she came to my rescue. An hour later, as Mar was getting increasingly furious with me, I got a call from my sister saying she was outside. I let Mar know and ran out of the house, relieved my day of prom with her was now over. A few months later, I got an anonymous letter in the mail addressed to me. Inside were 3 whole pages, filled front to back with a declaration of love from Mar. It explained how she fell in love with me at first sight, how everything I did made her love me so much more. She couldn't live without me anymore. I met up with a friend a few days later, and he showed me all these Snapchat conversations with her, just walls of texts. questions asking personal things about me. For the next year while I was in college, I would get random texts and Snapchats from her, showing pictures of her coming to my town and asking where I was. There were times she would go to my town's high school games and send pictures of our coaches with their jackets and the name of my town on there. Eventually, she stopped messaging me because I blocked her on everything, but I don't know if that means she stopped following me at all. I met my stalker when I was in middle school. My school consisted of 7th grade through 12th grade and had a normal program and an accelerated program. The students within each program were pretty segregated from each other. My friends and I all belonged to the accelerated program, but there was one guy in the group from the normal program named Carson. We were all typical teenagers, with Carson being the group's prankster. We could only hang out at school, really, because we were all shipped in from various parts of the county for the accelerated program. After school, we would all get on AOL to chat and play games together. Online, we had even more friends, as we'd each invite our own local friends to chat with everyone. One day, Carson invited his friend Steve to join in. He was nice and contributed a lot to the conversation. We learned that Steve actually attended our school too, but he was in the normal program, and so had a different lunch period than the rest of us. We had almost no chance of crossing paths with each other. We insisted on meeting him in person, however, and scheduled for Steve to come to my locker to meet up with everyone before first period. The next morning, we waited, and Steve never came. My friend and I did have a short exchange with another kid, though, Marco, which consisted of us telling him to go away. Marco had been Carson's satellite since the beginning of the year. Wherever Carson went, Marco would stand 10 to 15 feet away watching us all. We had tried to become friends with him, but he was simply too strange. He would do things like touch your face unexpectedly or try to sneak up behind you and bite you. He'd tell you he wanted to see you inside out. His list of strange behaviors was a mile long. A few days after Steve failed to come meet with us, it came to light that Steve was actually Marco, and the whole thing was one of Carson's pranks. Considering Marco had been a pleasant addition to the chat as Steve, though, we gave him another chance to join the real group as well. Besides Carson, though, I was the only person that really gave Marco a chance. He still did all the weird things he had always been doing, but now it was more apparent it was more of an act to get attention for being the weird guy than anything really malicious. Marco was being abused at home by his mom's boyfriend. He rarely saw his mother because she worked so damn much. Marco became the poster child for bad attention is still attention because of this. Still, my other friends wanted him out of the group. I repeatedly found myself arguing his case to let him stay. Once I caught an older student beating Marco up, a boy that lived on my street. Being much larger than either of us, he was literally picking Marco up and slamming him around while calling him a freak. Knowing the bully and his mother, I did what was my signature move at the time and kicked him in the balls while threatening to tell his mom on him about how he was treating me and my friends. I believe this was the catalyst for years of torment, as Marco instead became my satellite after that day. At school, Marco followed me any chance he got. At home, he would message me non-stop, typically in private chats, as my other friends no longer wanted anything to do with him. I felt a bit bad. He was a sweet kid besides his weird attention-seeking stunts, and no one should have to go through life with no friends. Eventually, Marco asked me out, which I politely declined. He was my friend, but he was not the type of guy I would ever be interested in dating. He was persistent, though, begging me to give him a chance. Over and over again, I would have to tell him no. One day, his approach suddenly changed. "You will go out with me, or I'll show your mom all of our chat logs." There was nothing especially bad in there. I wasn't drinking or doing drugs or anything bad. I was pretty depressed at the time though, and sometimes talked about wanting to hurt myself. If my parents saw any of that, I could effectively kiss my freedom and privacy goodbye. I tried to bluff him, telling him good luck with any attempts to convince my parents to believe him over me. That actually seemed to work. I was not very impressed with the stunt either, and stopped talking to him soon after. A few weeks went by and Marco came crawling back begging for forgiveness. Eventually I caved in, allowing him back into the group with me. At first he was well behaved again, but he slowly started pestering me to be his girlfriend once more. Over the course of high school he tried many different methods: begging, blackmailing, attacking my self-esteem by calling me ugly and a slut, catfishing me, threatening any guys I dated, and more. I tried to be nice at first, but eventually I had to get mean in how I said no. His behavior would always reach a boiling point that forced me to cut him out of our friend group. It was nearly impossible to actually get rid of him, however. Online, he would create dozens of new accounts to send messages from, overwhelming my attempts to block him. He would call my phone all night long and leave woeful messages about how lonely he was and how he would kill himself if I stopped being his friend. He would show up at my house and stand outside my bedroom window at random times. When my parents had parties like the 4th of July, Thanksgiving, or Halloween, he would always manage to find out and show up. Because these parties were always pretty big with an open-door policy, he'd slip in, usually in disguise. Then he'd do something to get thrown out, like get belligerently drunk or stuff his face with all the food, then slam them back down on the serving platters. The first time I really felt that Marco might be an actual threat, though, was at one of my parents' Halloween parties when we were 16. One of my dad's friends had a son our age named Tim. He was a bit of a joke and fancied himself pretty cool. He thought it would be fun to pick a fight with a weird kid, make a display of his superior strength. Marco accepted his challenge. We all knew he was going to get the crap beat out of him. Going out into the streets, Tim towered over Marco. That year, he was dressed as Alex from A Clockwork Orange, his favorite book, with his costume including a cane. He swung the cane at Tim, hitting him in the head with it. Tim went down quickly, and Marco beat him over and over until an adult intervened and sent him home. Marco's go-to threat became whenever I had a boyfriend. I'll beat him to death with a shovel and use it to bury his body. Suddenly, this threat seemed like something he was more than capable of. Our senior year of high school, Marco's dad died in prison. He learned the real reason his dad was put away was for murdering someone. He'd always thought his dad was in there for drugs, and he started to spiral out of control. He said that his dad was a murderer, so he must be doomed to be one too. He dropped out of school halfway through the year. My brother said that after I had left home for college, Marco came to the house looking for me a few times. Once he figured out I wasn't there, he'd come and stand in the front yard aimlessly, playing with a Bic lighter, until someone threatened to call the police. One of my biggest fears was that he'd try to set our house on fire in some weird way of trying to punish me. When I'd go home with my boyfriend, he'd always show up at my parents' house. At one point, he even tried to intimidate my boyfriend into breaking up with me by showing him his big knife. It was always an ordeal to get him to leave. A lot of issues have now eased up just due to distance and time. I don't use social media much anymore, and I'm able to semi-block people on my phone. Initially, he was calling and texting every day. Hundreds and hundreds of messages. I tried asking him to stop, but this only encouraged him. My family no longer lives in that area, so I'm significantly less worried for their safety. I found the most successful way of dealing with him to be simply ignoring him. Eventually, his messages dwindled down to once a week, then once a month. Now I hear from him maybe officially once a year. His message is typically something along the lines of, "Please just be my friend. I won't try for anything more. I need you in my life." The last time I actually talked to him, which was about 4 to 5 years ago now, Marco tried to tell me I'd ruined his life. He said I put some spell on him and that he couldn't move forward with anything. He told me he would kill himself and it would be all my fault. I finally had to tell him I wouldn't care if he did. In fact, it would be quite the relief if he did so. His most recent MO is to call my work phone from a private number just to hear me answer the phone, then hang up. He also calls and texts my brother, our high school friends, my brother's best friend, my parents, my grandparents, my aunt, and my husband, all to beg them to ask me to call him. He messaged my husband, "Tell her she's my angel, the love of my life. I'm nothing without her." I'm worried he'll snap someday and show up at my house or job and try to end me. I have security systems and other means of protection, but I'm still very paranoid about it. I've talked to the police about getting a restraining order, but they told me there's no real grounds unless he does start showing up and threatening to kill me, so I guess we'll see what happens. This story is not as shocking or traumatic as some of the ones you might have heard before, perhaps, but when it was happening to me, I was extremely upset and unnerved by it. This happened many years ago. I was newly single and looking for a way to meet new people, so I thought I would try my luck at online dating. I created a profile and went about speaking to some men online. I even met up for a few coffee dates or lunch. My initial nervousness at the prospect of meeting strangers online for possible romance was calmed down somewhat. I learned that there were actually quite a lot of nice guys out there just looking for the same companionship I was. I started to become more optimistic. In the past, I had this habit of dating men that were non-commitment types. I realized that I was ready to try and find somebody that wanted something a little more serious. I made a big mistake, though. In formulating this goal, I had largely blamed myself for my failed past relationships, reasoning that perhaps I had somehow unconsciously chosen a partner who was not ready for commitment. I decided I should try and be more open to nice, sincere men who seemed ready for the kind of relationship I was ready for. In doing so, I ended up ignoring the gut instincts I had always followed, and that came back to bite me. This is where Mark enters the scene. Mark worked in banking and was divorced with one child. He was fairly good-looking, articulate, and we shared many interests. We began chatting online. This progressed to phone calls after a couple of days, and finally the idea arose to meet for coffee. Looking back, I now note that he seemed in a hurry to meet me right from the get-go, despite me saying I preferred to speak for a while initially. We decided on a possible date, general location, and general time, but nothing was truly confirmed. I recall at the time I was actually fairly busy, and as we began to get closer to the date, I felt like I was going to be too busy to meet up with anyone. In the days leading up, without a location or exact time set, I didn't get back to him. I ended up getting tied up with other things and didn't know when I'd be free. I hadn't spoken to him in several days by this point. This is where the first red flag occurred, and in retrospect, I should have passed altogether on further meeting. As I said though, I was trying out this new attitude of being more open and accepting of nice men. On the date we discussed meeting initially, I was out somewhere doing something when my phone rang. I noticed it was Mark. I picked it up and he spoke to me in a warm tone. "Hey, I'm in your neighborhood. I know we said we were going to meet today, but where would you like to meet me? 'Cause I'm here right now waiting." I found this alarming because not only had I never gotten back to him with a time or location, I knew for a fact he lived 2 cities away, and it would have taken a lot of time to drive down on the loose plan of a meeting that had never been confirmed. Again, I told myself, this man must really want to meet you. That shows he's sincere, I guess. Enjoy this for a change. Against my gut instinct, I told him I would simply meet him on a different day, and we agreed on a concrete date and time instead. When the date arrived, it went surprisingly well. He was just as good looking in real life. We had good conversations, and he was very nice. We started seeing each other. He was all about romantic gestures, paying attention to me, calling me, generally just being kind and sweet every day. He always seemed to want to spend time with me, and I told myself that this is what I had been missing for a long time. I tried my best to appreciate the gestures and attention as something positive, even though I wasn't really used to this much. It did feel a little strange as well, because I didn't know him that well. He would do things like show up unannounced with flowers to my work, only a short time after meeting each other in person. He was very touchy and feely, something I wasn't used to, and he did it in an off-putting way. I was uncomfortable with his constant touching and rubbing of me all over the place, generally suffocating me with his presence even while we were in public. I recall one time telling him that I was going downtown with a group of girlfriends for a birthday celebration, and he insisted we should go out for a drink alone beforehand. I said that was not really necessary, because I only had an hour or so to spend prior to going out with them. The drive for him to get there was already an hour or more. This would be an extreme amount of trouble to go through just to see me for a short period of time, but he insisted that even a single hour would be worth it. When he arrived, I met him at a local pub. We had a drink, and then he laughed and joked that he should just come downtown with me and my girlfriends. I told him no. That was really weird. He wasn't invited, and that was not what we had discussed. He went home dejected, and that was the first time I felt a little bit off about him. Things went on, though, and I spent the night at his house after about 3 weeks. I told him I had plans the next day, and I would have to get going at about 10 a.m. or so. When I went to leave the next morning, though, he got very distressed and kept insisting I should stay because it was such a beautiful day. It was such a real shame I was leaving because there were so many wonderful things we should do together. He blocked me in. I should also mention that for the past week or so, he'd been insisting he loved me and would tell me multiple times a day. I didn't reciprocate because I wasn't ready for that yet. When I went to leave out the front door, he wrapped himself in front of me in the doorway and kissed me over and over, repeating the words, "I love you, you're everything I want in a woman," like a robot. I got really grossed out at the way he was behaving. I shoved him out of the way and left very irritated, although I didn't say anything, as I really did need to get going. I decided before I was even out of his driveway that I was never going to meet up with him again. Over the next day or two, I thought about how I would let him down and talked it over with my friends. I kicked myself too for deliberately ignoring my gut. During this time, I responded to his relentless phone calls with polite texts to stall him until I was ready to come up with a response. Finally, I settled on what I felt was a compassionate but firm approach to letting him down. I spoke to him on the phone and explained I had come to the conclusion that I was not at a point in my life where I wanted this relationship whatsoever, with anyone, including him. That was a lie, of course, but I didn't want to hurt his feelings. He kept trying to question what he had gotten wrong, what he'd misunderstood, but I just kept repeating that nothing was wrong. I simply didn't want to date. I went with this approach out of a complete lack of interest in doing anything to enlighten him what a turn-off his behavior was. I already had enough responsibility in my life. I had no desire to add him to it. Since we'd only been seeing each other less than a month, I thought that would be the end of it. But boy, was I wrong. I woke the following day to find a long, desperate email in my inbox. Basically, he said he was mentally ill. He was taking antidepressants that he blamed for his clingy behavior, although I had not complained to him about this at all. He ended by saying he would throw out all his medication, and therefore we should date again. The tone of the letter was very panicked and weird. I ignored it. Then the real onslaught began. Over the following weeks or so, he blew up my work phone, cell phone, and email with non-stop messages. I became increasingly annoyed at how entitled he felt to dismiss everything I said and to blatantly intrude in my life with such a relentless stream of calls and emails. At work, for example, he called my desk phone 34 times in a 3-hour period. My coworkers were flabbergasted and even offered to answer and scream in his ear. I cannot understand why he thought this behavior would somehow make me like him, but obviously it did the exact opposite. He even began to use attempts like regarding a pair of cheap plastic scratch sunglasses he left in his car. He claimed they were very expensive and were heirlooms from his mother, and she would be very upset if I didn't return them to him. Whatever. I drove to his house and dumped them in his mailbox. I finally texted him back after this to say, "They're in your mailbox. Don't contact me again." Of course, that didn't stop him though. The onslaught continued for days on end. He'd always exclaimed that I'd left something small, like a scarf or something at his house, and that he needed to return it to me. I'd send him another text. "I told you to stop harassing me. If you contact me again, I'm calling the cops." Eventually, this did work. Well, sort of. I continued to get Facebook messages from him for years after, even though we were not friends. I never responded to a single one. In the last one, he told me he was following me out in public somewhere. I was with my giant husband at the time, thank God. He wrote how good I looked, and added that he hoped still that we could be friends again one day. No thanks, Mark. I do not want to be your friend. But thanks for the lesson you taught me. Never ignore your instincts. Listening to mine led me to the next awesome, sincere, and unclingy man that I ended up marrying. It started during Christmas break last year. A close friend of mine had an appointment for a pretty detailed tattoo, so she wanted me to come along with the boyfriend she had at the time, and his best friend Chuck. Now, mind you, I had never once met this Chuck before, but he's the main star of our story here. My friend and I were supposed to meet up with Chuck at Dunkin' Donuts before the appointment, since he was also supposed to be getting a tattoo done. When he arrived, he wasn't at all who I expected him to be. He seemed pretty cool at first. Then, though, he started acting like one of those fake deep people who thinks they know everything about someone by looking into their eyes. He kept telling me he really liked that he could see I was a person who suffered like he has, and at one point he even said, "Your eyes are like a vortex." Needless to say, it kinda weirded me out. I figured it wouldn't be that big a deal, though. Since the whole purpose of meeting up was to get some tattoos, we started talking about that instead. I showed him the tattoos I already had and what other ones I had planned. For some reason, Chuck insisted that he buy a small, relatively cheap tattoo for me. I kept on trying to say no, on behalf of the fact that I just met him an hour ago. But he kept insisting it was no big deal. As weird as it made me feel, I decided to simply go with it. No use in arguing. Fast forward to the appointment. We're sitting there in the parlor's lobby, waiting for the artist to be done with their current client. All of a sudden, Chuck starts acting weird. He's saying he's having an anxiety attack. Obviously, I don't take that lightly, but I was confused as to what was happening. Regardless of how odd it seemed, though, we tried to calm him down. While my friend was getting her large thigh piece done, I got the tattoo Chuck had offered to pay for. It was just a short quote on my arm, and only took about 10 minutes. After this, Chuck got his small hand tattoos done. This is when he decided he wanted to get one to commemorate our meeting. I was really unsure about this. It was so weird. He was married, and I wasn't sure if his wife was a jealous person. Either way, it didn't seem very appropriate. He kept on saying, though, that I was a cool-ass chick who was spontaneous like him. I can't remember exactly why, but the talk of my initials came up. He really liked that my initials were SSS. So this man, who I'd met just 2 hours before, decided to get that tattooed on the front of his wrist. I was very uncomfortable now. I wasn't sure what to do. My friend and her at-the-time boyfriend were too occupied doing their own things to say much, so I just kind of zoned out and went with it. After that was over, we all parted ways, and he told me he was going to start texting me. I thought he meant he would text me like 1 or twice after and disappear, but surprisingly, he tried to talk to me a whole lot. He was actually kind of a nuisance. I replied to him anyway though, because I liked that he took me seriously, and I was insecure in that period of time. Things got more and more weird though. He would constantly ask me if I wanted to go and watch movies with him and his wife. At one point, we ended up talking about my sexuality. He told me it was so cool with him because his wife was also bisexual. He kept on saying his wife wanted to meet me. It was getting more and more suggestive. As time went on, I started replying less because I was pretty sure he had some sort of weird fetish going on with me. And that's when shit hit the fan. One night, Chuck was drunk. He was actually pretending and decided to profess his love for me. He said he'd fallen in love with me the second he met me and was so overwhelmed with the feeling it caused him to have the anxiety attack I mentioned earlier. Of course, he was married, and I had no interest in him. I had never once led him on or even suggested I liked him. I hadn't even talked to him that much. He told me his marriage was falling apart. I texted the friend from earlier in the story, and she told me he was lying about everything. The next day while I'm in class, he texts me and told me he lied about everything himself. As you can imagine, I was livid. How fucked up was it to lie to me about things like that, especially saying his wife was cheating on him and stuff? He tried to tell me he'd never do anything like that again, but I wasn't having it. I'll admit I said some pretty brutal things to him, but it was well deserved. I decided my best decision was to block him. Afterwards, my friend would text me all the time, saying Chuck was harassing her to try to get through to me. At this point, both of us were done with his shit. He was causing a lot of issues. Even a few months after the incident, her boyfriend cut him off too, because he was starting to harass him as well. Even though it was nearly a year ago, I still wonder how he feels when he looks down at his wrist and sees my initials there. It's not uncommon to go through some hard times in your early 20s, whether that's trying to find a job to save money or starting a family with the right partner, you name it. I'm sure there's a long list of people that share those struggles. I, of course, also went through some hard times in my early 20s, but I'm sure my situation is a little more unorthodox than that. I had every advantage in life growing up. I was funny, athletic, I had a loving family and great friends, and I came from a wealthy enough background that as long as I applied myself, I could have a pretty comfortable life. Yeah, that didn't exactly happen. I was too obsessed with being the funny guy, and I was never going to be good enough to be a pro athlete by any means. I was good enough to play football in college, though. I decided in my senior year of high school that I would rather party and hang out with my friends. Sports isn't everything. My parents were cool with me giving football up, even if it meant me giving up scholarships. I didn't have those sorts of parents that forced me to do sports or hobbies to get ahead. But I didn't expect that giving up that structure of football in my life forced me into doing some shady things in my free time. Long story short, I barely even made it through my senior year, and by the end of summer, I'd had a big falling out with my parents. I never went to college. Instead, I moved across to the East Coast for a few years, just being useless and offering nothing to society really. Looking back, I was hanging out with questionable people at best and doing things I'm not very proud of. I have yet to come to peace with it now, and I'm in my 30s. My parents lived in Pennsylvania. I started making my way back up north when I was 22 years old in an attempt to kind of apologize and turn my life around finally. I had reached my breaking point and decided I couldn't be homeless anymore. I was starting to feel really sick, and I knew that something wasn't right on the inside. I hitchhiked a massive chunk of the journey, and when I reached Virginia, I started walking again. I didn't call my parents, though. I didn't think they ever wanted to see me or talk to me again. I also didn't have a phone or any way to reach them, really. My plan was just to show up on their doorstep and hope for the best. One night, I think I was still in Virginia. I was walking through this nice park. I'm not talking about those playground parks. This was a massive area of forest with all types of trails running through it. I bet during the day, under the right circumstances, this place was probably gorgeous. Tonight, though, the dark trails were quiet and desolate, and for the first time in a long time, I felt somewhat at peace. It was pitch black, but I didn't mind. I always liked the dark, especially since I had been homeless. I considered nightfall to be one of my best friends. I figured I would find a quiet place to lay down and get a relaxing night's sleep before the sun rose. Then I could continue my walk home. I was so exhausted that I fell asleep right away. I don't know how long I'd been sleeping when I was awoken slowly to the sound of whispering. One thing about being homeless is that you learn to kind of sleep with one eye open. I rolled to the side of the big tree I was leaning on and tried to focus in the darkness to see where the sounds were coming from. Well, I didn't need to be a detective to find the source. About 15 feet away from me was a group of men. I think there were 5 of them, but there may have been 1 or 2 more. They had flashlights and were shining them into the forest where I was laying. I heard one of the guys shout from the darkness, "He's over there! I know I saw a person sleeping." The light danced back and forth, and then the beam stopped directly on my face. The guy with the light shouted out, "Oh dude, he's right here!" I heard them continue to whisper and laugh. I didn't know what these guys wanted. As I stared back like some frightened animal, the man holding the light said in a confident voice, "It's okay, dude. Come on out. Why you sleeping out here in the woods?" For some reason, I felt safe about this and started making my way toward the group of guys. I told them I was homeless and trying to make my way back home. As I got closer, the guys were all eyeing me down. They seemed to be smiling, like they were greeting an old friend. One of the guys grabbed my arm and helped me over to some rocks to join them. As soon as I was face to face with the group, the guy with the light shouted, "Oh dude, you reek!" Another guy started to laugh uncontrollably. I started to feel kind of embarrassed. I was going to try and say something, but before I could even get any words out, the man with the flashlight struck me across my face with the light. I fell to the ground, holding my head in pain. I could hear the guy laughing and joking as they all started to kick me while I was down, screaming things like, "Get a job, deadbeat! Stop ruining our parks with your filth!" I gave up trying to fight back after a while and just let the beatdown continue. They stopped after a few minutes. As I was laying there, I could feel the ground spinning beneath me. These guys had done a real number on me. They started to talk among themselves about something completely unrelated, a girl from class or something. I couldn't believe they'd just beaten me so badly that I couldn't even see straight, and they were completely unfazed while talking about this girl. I tried to get up and make a run for it, but as soon as I got to my feet, I felt dizzy. The world started spinning as I tried to take a step. I must have looked real messed up, because the guys started to cackle right behind me. And through their hysterical laughter, one of the guys looked at me. "Look at him trying to run. Look how stupid he looks." I'm not sure how far I made it before I felt an intense pain in the back of my head. Everything went completely black. I remember these passing moments, seeing the guys walking by and laughing. The only thing I can really remember as they were roughly college age. They had to be since they were talking about people in class. I think one of them had a Virginia University shirt on. Next thing I remember is waking up in the woods, surrounded by a few different people. They were hikers on their phone with the paramedics. I was somehow able to form enough sentences to tell them my name and a few details of the prior evening. One of the women who was sitting with me while waiting for the paramedics asked if she could call someone for me. This is when I finally broke down and just called my parents on her phone. They wasted no time and drove down to Virginia to get me and make sure I was all right. After that night, my life changed pretty drastically. It turned around, really. I moved home for a while until I got back on my feet and started online programs for college. Eventually, I got my business degree. When I was homeless, I had seen some messed up things, but none of those things held a candle to that night. I thought my life was going to be over in that moment, surrounded by insane adults that feel no remorse as they attacked another human being, then laughed as I lied there, nearly motionless and in pain. Monsters aren't always hiding under your bed or in your closet. Sometimes they can be the very normal people we see in our everyday lives. I've spent the better part of the last 4 years taking care of my sick grandfather. My grandmother died over 10 years ago, and unfortunately, my dad didn't have a good relationship with his father. It wasn't easy toward the end, but he ended up passing away a few months back. I took it much harder than the rest of the family, since I spent a lot more time with Grandpa. I guess it should have come as no surprise to me, though, that he left me his house in the will. The house was in pretty bad shape, though. For starters, it wasn't in a great area. My grandparents had built the house almost 70 years ago, when the area was nothing but forests and a few roads. Now, the house was in a busy area of the town. The neighborhood where the house sits is one of the most crime-ridden areas in my hometown. Add that to the fact the house hadn't had any updates or repairs in over a decade, and you have a house that's quite honestly not really wanted by anyone. I spoke to a realtor who told me they would be able to sell the house even though it was in a rough area. It was big, and she told me people would often buy houses in these areas to accommodate their entire families. She gave me a small list of things I needed to do first. Then we were going to list the house the following week. I tirelessly cleaned that house for days on end. In his older age, my grandpa had become a bit of a hoarder and had things everywhere. Not only that, but I just kind of felt depressed being there. I'd spent so much time there as a child, and even into adulthood. One night, I decided I was going to stay overnight and bang out the rest of my cleaning. My husband didn't stay, because he had to work in the morning. I was okay with that though, truthfully. I wanted to be here alone anyway, to come to peace with the fact my grandpa had moved on. I truly worked all night. When I finally looked back at the clock, it was almost 3:30 in the morning. I was shocked and felt good about the work I had done. I went into the living room, which was at the back of the house. I turned on a small desk lamp and started to read for a little while. I planned on reading until I got tired and fell asleep. I couldn't have been reading for longer than 5 minutes, though, when I started to hear a very strange noise. I did listen to it, but I didn't pay much attention to the noise at first. Eventually, though, it became much too hard to ignore. It sounded like movement. I tried to reason with my logic and tell myself it was either my old pipes or my imagination of my grandpa. He'd just passed away after all, and I really missed him. It was entirely possible I was subconsciously trying to convince myself this was a sign from him. I slowly made my way down the long and dark hallway and toward the noises. They were getting louder and louder. At this point, it was just too hard to ignore. When I got to the front door, I was standing right next to the basement door. Whatever this sound was, it was clearly coming from down in the basement. The basement of this house was sort of strange. From where I was standing in the kitchen, it was a long staircase down. In the back of the basement, though, you could just walk out the door. This is because my grandparents' house sits on a hill. I opened the basement door. The sounds were loud and echoing through the staircase. I don't know if it was just because I was sad or plain stupid, but my mind was telling me these noises were from my grandpa giving me some sort of sign from the afterlife. I slowly made my way down toward the basement. As I turned the corner, though, I saw two men digging through my grandpa's boxes. I quickly ran behind a stack of boxes and froze in place. The men had a flashlight, and I saw the beam of light fly toward my direction for just a moment, then go back to where it was before. I could hear them talking and shushing each other, but I couldn't make out any words. The only thing I did hear was a muffled voice. "Be quiet. You don't want to wake that old man." Whoever these guys were, they thought my grandpa was still alive. I was praying they would leave and not find me, hiding on the other side of the basement. I was too scared to make a run for it, and I didn't dare take two people on at once. My phone was upstairs, and my purse was in the kitchen. I figured my best course of action was to stay hidden and hope they didn't find me. A couple of minutes at least had passed, and the two guys ran off out the back door of the basement. I waited for a while after that moment before I moved. Once I decided it was safe, I ran upstairs, got my purse, and drove home. At this point, it was 4:45 in the morning, and my husband would be waking up for work soon. I came back frantically, and my husband woke up. I told him everything, and he called into work so he could stay with me for the day. We went over to my grandparents' house in the morning so we could look and see if the back door was damaged and if anything had been stolen. Most notably, the door was not broken. Whoever had gotten in through the basement had just walked right in. Admittedly, I hadn't been down there that much, so I didn't even bother to check if the other door had been locked prior. We looked at the boxes they were going through. They didn't have too much in them that I would consider valuable. It was newspapers, pictures, and some old knickknacks. I suppose they could have taken something valuable, but I don't even know. What could have been down there that was so valuable anyway? We did end up making an official report. When all was said and done, I didn't expect any answers. By the time it crossed my mind to call the police, I was already almost home, and figured by that point it was a waste of time. We eventually finished cleaning the house during the daytime hours, then sold it a couple of weeks later. I'll never forget that memory of seeing those two men standing in my grandpa's basement, rummaging through all his things. Almost 5 years ago, I moved to Vermont from Maryland. Not for myself, but for my wife, who'd secured some type of hospital administration job. I don't really know the specifics of the job myself. All I know was the pay was outstanding enough that it made it worth moving, not to mention her new company paid for us to move. Back home in Maryland, I didn't have what you would call a great job. It wasn't bad either, though. It was enough to make a living off of. I was a manager of one of the local supermarkets in the area. The only issue I really had was that I'd already hit a ceiling for my pay, and my wife was starting at a drastically higher rate than I was already making. That meant it was a no-brainer. We settled into the new place in no time. My wife made friends at her new job almost right away, and life was looking pretty good. I was looking for work all over, and I ended up getting a job at Target. That job only lasted about 2 weeks though, because I got a call for a much better paying job. A small independently owned supermarket was not far away from where we lived, and it just so happened they were looking for a new store manager. I loved this job at first. It wasn't anything like working in a chain store like I had done in the past. It was fairly low maintenance, and the hours were fantastic. The store was only open from 7 in the morning till 8 at night. Within just a couple of months, I was already running that store like a well-oiled machine. The owner loved me and trusted me. Surprisingly, I was making much more at this independent store than I had been at the chain market in Maryland. One afternoon, the owner came in and started ranting about how he hated all the end displays and how they looked. He decided he wanted to do a full remodel. I will say the average person would never notice this, but this guy ran a good company, and he wanted everything to be in top shape all the time. Can't say I really blame him. There he started talking about hiring some extra hands to do all this remodeling. I told him not to waste his money. I suggested instead I come in overnight for a few days next week and knock out all that remodeling stuff he wanted myself. He agreed, and we locked it into the schedule for the next week. I scheduled myself and 3 other employees to work overnight Tuesday through Thursday. I figured having 8 hours overnight uninterrupted would be plenty enough time. Tuesday night came and went, and we made some good progress. I was looking forward to the rest of the shifts because we had a lot of fun that night. We just blasted our favorite music and went to town redoing displays, cleaning, and totally revamping one section of the store. Wednesday night started just like Tuesday. We were doing an awesome job. Sometime during the middle of the shift, though, one of the employees, a woman named Jade, came up to me. She looked like she had just seen a ghost. I asked her if she was okay. She shook her head and asked if we could talk in the office for a minute. When we got to the office, I asked her if she was okay again. She looked more concerned and angry at this point than scared and upset. In a low voice, as if she was trying to be quiet, she said, "When I was in the bathroom, someone came in and stood on the other side of the door. I yelled at them, and they just stood there like a full minute. Then they turned around and ran out the bathroom." I took in everything she'd just said. I understood her concerns. Jane was the only woman on my crew tonight, so whoever was in the bathroom with her obviously was not supposed to be there. Jade's a tough woman who doesn't take crap from anybody. She didn't want to tiptoe around this. She wanted to go out there point blank and ask who had gone and followed her into the women's restroom. So, one thing about working for an independent company is that sometimes you can handle things in more unconventional ways. I don't always agree with this, but sometimes it's easier to just get to the bottom of things. I confronted the other employees directly. They all denied it rather passionately. A minute later, Jade joined us in one of the aisles, and a big screaming match ensued. All of a sudden, though, Jade stopped yelling. We all looked at her confused, and noticed she was looking down at the shoes of the other employees. "I'm so sorry, I don't think it was any of you guys." The person standing there had these brown shoes and blue jeans. I could see the fade on the bottom from underneath the stall. I looked over, and all the other employees were wearing sneakers. We all went into the back room as one and made our way to the bathrooms. Located near the bathroom door was some back stock that had been knocked over. One of the boxes looked like it had a dent from a boot in it. I can't speak for everyone, but I felt a pit forming in my stomach. Right above the bathrooms was a storage area, almost like a loft or crawl space. I don't know if everyone else was having the exact same thoughts, but I was thinking that someone was hiding up there. It made sense to me. It was right above the woman's bathroom, and they would have had to climb on the back stock to get up there. I grabbed a ladder and went up to the storage area. It was a mess up there. All the holiday decorations, extra shelves, old promotional materials, you name it. It was all shoved up there. I got to the top and took a few steps around. I noticed some beer cans on the ground and empty boxes of cookies. I even saw an empty tray of ground beef. I was taking careful steps as I moved through the area, and then I saw him. Right there in the back corner of the loft was a man. He was just standing there, staring right back at me. What was the most horrifying was that he had been standing there the entire time, and I had just noticed him. His eyes were so bug-eyed wide, they looked like they were going to pop out of his head. His hair was wild, and he looked angry. I stood still at first, making eye contact and trying to decide what to do. I heard one of my coworkers yell from the bottom, "Hey, anything up there?" I yelled back to call the police right now. As I finished saying that, the man charged at me. Thankfully, it was such a mess up there that he tripped over something in the darkness and hit his head. He started rolling around in pain, and I started to yell, 2 of my employees ran up there and helped me hold the man down as he started to recompose himself. He started to scream and squirm around, but my employees were pretty big. This man was not going anywhere. The cops thankfully showed up quickly as well. The owner showed up too, since I'd called him as soon as we had the guy held down. The cops arrested the man, and we were left with one wild story. We found out after the fact that the man had a knife on him, but he'd never pulled it out since he'd tripped. He used to work at the store apparently when he was 18 years old. He was in his 30s now, and sadly not really all there mentally anymore. I don't know what happened to him. The incident just happened recently, and when it was over, nobody really wanted to talk about it. For me, it was one of the craziest and scariest moments of my life though, being face to face with this man in the darkness. Even if I didn't get physically hurt, I still think about this all the time. Especially when I look up at the storage area. It's just scary to think about the fact that sometimes when you're supposed to be alone, you're really not. Hi. Me, my sister, and my mom have been trying to make sense of this for the past couple of hours, and the facts get less comforting the more we compare our experiences of that night. So last Friday night, I, 17 and male, was home alone, while my whole family, besides my sister who's 21, who was at work at the time, stayed in their cabin a few kilometers away. I'm used to staying home alone, as this exact scenario is very common in the summertime, especially while I'm working and can't really travel to and from the cabin and back. I'm not usually super jumpy or afraid while home alone. I used to get a bit scared by the odd creaks and settling noises of our house, but I didn't get that way anymore. I was especially comforted by the fact my sister's dog was also in the house with me that night. Heck, most of those noises I could simply attribute to him, and if anything were to happen to me, he would act like a guard dog of sorts and alert me to any odd goings-on. At the same time, however, he was one of those dogs who was the type to bark at any noise or person walking past the door or windows, so I was used to hearing him bark or growl at night. Even so, this past Friday, the sound of his barks at nearly 12 a.m. were disconcerting to say the least. Despite my comfort with staying home alone, I'm terrified of the premise of a break-in or some other uninvited human interaction at midnight. I let him bark for a few moments, telling myself it was just someone walking past our glass door in the adjacent alleyway or something, and he would quiet down once they passed by. Needless to say, since you're hearing this, that's not what happened. He kept on barking and growling for a few moments too long. I finally got out of bed. I sleep in the basement, by the way. I walked upstairs to check out what was going on. As I had expected, he was standing wide at alert right next to the glass door. I was comforted for a moment until I walked over, ready to close the curtains and go back to sleep. When I saw the door was open 2 or 3 inches, I froze. I had let the dog out earlier that night, but I knew I closed that door. I never left this door open. I'm a paranoid person with bad anxiety, especially concerning break-ins and the like, so I would never, home alone, forget to close the door. I'm 100% certain. At the time, I didn't let myself think about these facts or even acknowledge I could have not left the door open though, because I knew that would send me into a spiral, possibly even a panic attack, if I didn't just explain this away. I closed and locked the door, double-checking it was certainly locked this time. Using the flashlight on my phone, since all the lights were off, I looked around the entire second floor of my 3-floor house. I searched the closets, the beds, other reasonable hiding spots just to put my mind at ease, and upon finding nothing, I went back downstairs to my own room. As I was down there trying to push away all the fear, I could hear Bosco walking around on the floor that doubles as my bedroom's roof. I thought I was overthinking it, when it started to sound like human footsteps accompanying Bosco's footsteps. He walked around for about 10 minutes before I put my earphones in and talked myself down until I could fall asleep. At 2 a.m. that same night, my sister came home from work. I woke up just a few minutes before this to Bosco down in the basement, which he never does, whining at my bedroom door. When I got up to let him out, my sister walked in. We let him out the front door rather than the glass patio door, letting him in the same way. Me and my sister talked for a while before I went back downstairs, and my sister went to the bathroom. I forgot all about the door incident from earlier, busy with work for the next few days, and forgot to mention it to anyone until tonight. My sister and mom were home with me for a movie night, while my dad and brothers were over at the cabin. I suddenly remembered the door situation when we were picking out horror movies to watch. I was sharing it as a creepy, almost humorous story before my sister spoke up. She said that night, the same night, an hour or so after they got home, they found the door was open again. The same door that I'd locked from the inside and not opened since earlier that night. My stomach dropped and I started shaking the second this was revealed. We first started trying to explain it away. Maybe my sister had let Bosco out as well and forgotten to close it until we both recalled we'd used the front door. Then we tried to justify a reason someone would break in and not steal anything, then proceed to stay a whole 2 hours before leaving. Ultimately, I realized it was quite possible I'd locked an intruder in the home with me and forced them to hide upstairs while I searched the second level of our house. This hypothetical person would have been trapped up there, knowing this house was not empty. There was a dog who would bark if they showed themselves again, alerting me to their presence. Then, when I was in the basement and my sister was in the bathroom, they must have ran out the glass door. They had to have timed it perfectly, found a way to open the door once more, much wider than when I'd found it, as though they were in a hurry on the way out. Perhaps they left it open the first time for a quick escape, or to stop the loud sound of it meeting the door frame, and hadn't expected me to close it on them. Either way, it ties together too perfectly for me to reasonably brush it off. I know it's unlikely, especially with nothing missing, but in this small town there have been many reports of break-ins with nothing missing, vandalizing, or just breaking and entering many times for no known reason. So it's not as unlikely as it may seem. I can't exactly make sense of this. I'm shaken up thinking of the possibility of someone being in my home while I was asleep and alone in the basement. There's a part of me that doesn't want to believe it, but I can't shake the many coincidences that tie it all together to make this as concerning as it is. I'm just glad my searching came up empty that night, and I didn't have to meet this person face to face. Many years ago, before the kids, rescue animals, mortgage, and husband, I was a travel writer in Europe. I did most of my trips alone. This story is about the first time I visited Prague. I'd never been to Prague before, and the trip was last minute, so I had very little time to prepare. My travel partner had dumped me in another country, and I was determined to make the best out of this trip by visiting a place I'd never been to before. Upon arrival at the train station, I visited the accommodation office and asked for a hostel not too far from the center. In my early 20s, winging it like this was part of the fun. These days, I'm far less adventurous. The hostel they sent me to was a sprawling, crumbling, slate-gray Art Deco building on a nondescript street about a 10-minute walk from Stare Mesto. The inside was probably beautiful at one time, but by the time I'd checked in, it was full of shabby, mismatched furniture and cheap stained carpets. Most of the light fixtures were broken, so the lobby was very dark and gloomy. There was a faint smell of standing water and must in the air. I found my room, a double for $12 per night, and made note of the fact I had a roommate. She wasn't there, but on her side of the room there was a suitcase, a dress neatly folded across the back of a plastic chair, a scattering of random makeup containers, and a stack of German fashion magazines on the bed. As I had no plans or goals on this impromptu trip, I spent the afternoon exploring the old town square, the Jewish quarter, some various other areas as well. I purchased some Czech crystal for my mom and painted eggs from a street vendor for myself. I also made reservations for a sunset dinner cruise for one. Around 6 p.m., I returned to my room to shower, change clothes, and unload my purchases. When I left my room about an hour later, there was no indication my roommate had returned at any point during the day. After the cruise, I stopped at a tiny bar and had a glass of wine. I'd heard some horror stories about the dangers of Prague, but I felt no more trepidation than I did in any other large city. Sure, maybe the cobblestone streets, fog rolling off the Gothic architecture, and winding alleys made me think of Dracula or something, but in a good way, if you know what I mean. It was nearly midnight when I returned to my hostel, so I was very surprised to see my roommate still had not returned yet. I suppose that wasn't too uncommon though. Backpackers can be a very fickle lot. Maybe she'd gone on an overnight trip and left her stuff behind, or hooked up with someone and was holed up at their place for the night, maybe hanging out at another hostel or something. I was surprised but not too concerned. I took another shower before bed. However, upon stepping out, I was surprised to find that things in the room had changed upon my return. Her bed was neatly turned down, the magazines had moved to the nightstand, and the dress was gone. The strangest thing, though, was the addition of a silky pink nightgown spread across the bed, my bed. Maybe she thought she still had the room to herself? I didn't see how, though. My bags, clothes, and toiletries were in plain view. I gently moved the clothes over to her own bed, then settled in for the night as I wrote my journal. I assumed since things had moved around, she must be somewhere nearby, so I expected her to return shortly. After about an hour, though, her side of the room was still empty. I needed to use the restroom before I went to sleep, so I made one last trip down the hall. The building was very quiet this night. There weren't the regular sounds of chatting backpackers, the clinking of glasses, or the music that would normally leak through the walls. There was nothing. I found myself practically tiptoeing back because of the atmosphere. My room was near the end of the hall, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The corridor felt a little darker than before. The few working lights were blinking. It reminded me of a funhouse almost. A tightness began to fill my stomach, and I subconsciously quickened my steps. There wasn't a soul behind me that I could see, yet I kept glancing back over my shoulder, convinced I'd see someone gaining momentum on me. I was flooded with relief as I flung open my door and stepped inside, but that relief didn't last long. Mostly everything was exactly as I left it, except those clothes were now back on my bed. Sleep came in fits and starts. I left the lamp on for a while, still convinced my roommate would be back at any time. The shadows made the room even spookier. I'd finally just about drifted off into a deep sleep when I suddenly heard the door slowly open. A man stood in the darkened doorway. The hall light behind him showed just enough for me to see his contorted face. "I didn't mean to," he sobbed. "You have to help me." Too confused and disoriented to know what to do, I sat up and rubbed my eyes. I reached for the lamp switch, but once the room light was on, I saw the door was closed. There was no more man, and I heard footsteps moving back down the hallway. I quickly bounded off the bed and went for the door. It was locked. The man couldn't have entered without a key, and the hallway when I checked was empty. I had no idea where he'd gone. I passed the rest of the night fully clothed, sitting up in bed with the lights on. Though I'd paid for 2 additional nights, by 7 a.m. I gathered up my stuff and went down to the reception desk to check out. "By the way," I said to the 20-something receptionist, "my roommate never returned. I'm a little bit concerned about her." She picked up the room key, looked at it hard and frowned, then glanced at her computer. "What room were you in again?" When I repeated it to her, she looked back at her screen. "Ma'am, you're not supposed to have a roommate. The room's been empty for 3 weeks and it's been cleaned since then. There's only 6 people staying in the building right now." The hostel has since been renovated and is now a luxury hotel. I realize we didn't physically meet, I guess, but I thought it's relevant to mention that I did meet someone, and someone definitely entered and left my room. Have no idea how they got the key though. This happened years ago, but the thought of it still keeps me up at night. I was walking through the hills of a provincial park with my dog during the winter. The sun set much faster than I expected because of this, and it did so before I could get back to my car. Once the sun was gone and all you could see was darkness, I was walking slowly through a field when out of nowhere, I had to this day the most gut-wrenching, undeniable feeling I was being watched. I turned around, and in the distance, I could see a figure standing there, darker than the night sky around us. The instant I saw him, my stomach dropped, and my body literally froze. I just knew right away this man was going to come for me. I grabbed my dog's leash, and we booked it. I mean, full-on sprinting, full speed up and down hills, around trees, and down embankments. I was running so fast, it was as if my life depended on it, and to this day I'm sure it did. I made the 30 to 45-minute trip in only 10 minutes, and all that stood before me and my car was this switchback you had to go back and forth up if you wanted to reach the top. Once again, I'm giving it all I've got, running it up this switchback as fast as I possibly can. Once I reached the top and looked back down, I saw this person chasing me. Did he go up the switchback like how any sane person would? Of course not. He started sprinting right up the middle of this goddamn thing straight for me. I screamed at him to fuck off, but he didn't say anything, not a single word, just continued to run right at me. I'm so lucky my car was at the top of that hill, because as I ran towards it almost like a horror movie, I dropped my keys. I was fiddling with them trying to open the door. Just in time, I got that door open. I threw my dog inside and shut the door behind me, just as the man reached us. Best part is, there were no other vehicles parked anywhere around us, so where did this person park? Yeah, right next to me of all places. Now, this guy literally jumped into his truck so fast. To this day, I've never seen a better example of speeding out of there like a bat out of hell. He gunned his engine so hard black smoke started blasting out the back as he swerved out of there. He even left skid marks behind him. I sat in the back of my vehicle for hours afterward, shaking and crying, knowing I was this close to whatever he had planned for me. That's why I'm sharing this story, in hopes that people won't just ignore that gut feeling, that little voice in the back of your head telling you to run. If I ignored it that day, I never would have noticed him in time, and I would not have had the head start I needed to escape. Always trust your gut feelings and intuition. It might really be the deciding factor on if this is your final day on Earth or not. I've met a lot of sketchy people over the years. I used to run with a bad crowd, do drugs and the like, but for some reason, this one experience really sticks out to me. There was just something oddly cinematic about the whole thing, I suppose. I'll start by mentioning that I'm a 30-something woman living in a country-ish area in the west coast of the USA. It's a smaller town, but not so small it's completely isolated. It's just that there can be long stretches of land in between some of the homes. One of those stretches has a run-down but pretty swell deli that sells wine and other convenience store stuff. I'd been in there before during the day, and all around the people in there seemed really friendly. I'd never gotten a bad vibe off of any of them. Usually I'd grab my bag of chips or my deli selection or whatever and leave. The worst complaint I could possibly have was that some of them only spoke partial English. But that didn't really bother me much, and it never interfered with their job. That is, until I finally decided to go there at nighttime. I was having a rough day, so I decided to grab a bottle of wine on my way home from work for the weekend. I took the stretch of road leading to that convenience store. I remember thinking that I'd never noticed how creepy it was at night. If it was raining, it would have been right out of the movie Psycho, where Janet Leigh is pulling up to the hotel. Anyway, I get in there, prepared to just grab my wine and get out, but it seemed like the man working at the store had some other ideas. When he heard me walk in, he rushed out from the back and had the most intense and frightening, unwavering stare I'd ever seen. I remember I was so off-put, I tried to physically act nonchalant in response and say something to the tune of, "Hi there." I don't remember him blinking a single time during this entire encounter. The whole thing was just so creepy, coupled with how quiet the store was and how dark it was outside. I can't remember exactly what I said after, but nothing I did would break his unblinking gaze. He wouldn't respond to anything I said either. At one point, he asked me if I spoke Spanish. I said no. At that point, I relaxed a bit. Maybe it was just him being uncomfortable at not being able to speak English well. I felt a bit more at ease. I even felt a bit bad for him, actually. I'm sure people can be quite awful to workers who don't speak great English. That calm didn't last long, though. Almost immediately after, he followed up speaking English very well. "You are so beautiful. Do you have a boyfriend?" This admittedly threw me off a bit, because I'm fairly chubby and was by no means made up at all. He started bombarding me with questions. "Where do you live? Do you come by here a lot? When will I see you again?" I kept saying the usual, "Oh, that's nice" kind of stuff just to get the fuck out of there. After what seemed like an excruciating amount of time, made worse by this unblinking stare, the transaction was finally completed. I thought I'd made it home free, until I noticed he was following me outside. He'd left the inside of the store completely unattended, staring at me with the same creepy smile the entire time. I fumbled for my keys and tried to start my car to get the fuck out of there. The lighting at the front of the store shining on him against the dark night was like a scene straight out of a horror film. He stood there a couple of feet away from my car, watching me try to get it started. He didn't say a goddamn word. I could feel him staring at me for minutes on end, though. When I finally did back out of that driveway and onto the main road, I watched him in the rearview mirror as he followed me out into the center of the road, then stared at me the entire fucking way out until I hit the first curve and he disappeared out of sight. Friendly day crew or no friendly day crew, I never went back there again. I only recently started playing Pokémon Go, but after this experience, I'm much more hesitant about where I go with it. What I mean is, I used to drive and walk around everywhere, trying to locate all the Poké-stops I could and find all sorts of gym locations. For such an amazing game, there isn't really much player-to-player interaction, at least not just yet. That just makes this experience all the more surprising for me, though. I live in West Tennessee. For privacy reasons, I'd rather not say my exact city. I think I learned my lesson on caution this time. At the moment, around this place, it's maybe 10% town and 90% woods. It's the most beautiful place you'll ever see, especially during the fall. I've been here all my life, and I don't think I'll ever go anywhere else. Ever since I could first hold a Game Boy, I've been a huge Pokémon fan. I got Pokémon Red when it came out immediately. I just had to have the yellow version when it released too. I've owned at least one game for each generation. I think it was sometime in 2015 that I learned about the upcoming Pokémon Go and was insanely excited finding Pokémon in real life. What could go wrong? The other day when it released, I finally downloaded it, almost immediately as soon as it went live. I spent all day finding what nearby landmarks were Pokéstops, the local park, a fountain, and the university. There were dozens more like that, which is way more than I thought there would be, at least for my little town. It was extremely exciting, but being a sort of antisocial person, seeing all these other people gathering around these sordid locations made me very nervous. I tried to stay away if anyone else was there, for those exact same reasons. One day though, I spent a little bit of cash to get some Poké coins to buy Pokéballs. I planned on spending a few hours dedicated to catching as many different Pokémon as I could. You know, gathering up some stardust and candies. I had a couple of incenses as well. I decided to use those. Dozens of Pokémon and 2 incenses later, I was still reeling for more things to catch, but it wasn't coming very fast anymore. I was still sticking near my home at the time. We lived in a rural area with miles of woods in our backyard. I was walking around out there. I couldn't have been half a mile out, just wandering around and being a dork. The sun was beginning to set, but I had maybe a good 45 minutes or so before it really got dark. I'd never been worried too much about the dark anyway. It had been about 15 minutes since I had seen anything, and it was mostly low-level caterpies and metapods. That was about the time, though, that I saw a large patch of pink and purple on the app, just north of my location. It was about 30 or 40 yards away, and looked exactly like the incense you would use on yourself. I hadn't seen anything like this before on the game. I know there's a lot of stuff I hadn't tried yet, and items I had yet to use though. I was extremely nervous about going out this far just for Pokemon. For one, there were definitely no landmarks out here, so this couldn't have been something like that. If it wasn't that, then it must have been something another player put up. That would mean someone else was out there with me. I decided to stop being a wet noodle and investigate what was going on here. Maybe I'd end up with a new friend, or maybe a few more Pokémon. The shadows of the trees were cast even further now, and a lot of the forest was starting to become dim. The leaves were so thick that the woods got dark much more quickly than anything else. I didn't really give it too much thought though. A few minutes before it was completely dark, on my phone I noticed I was just at the outskirts of that purple ring. Almost the exact moment I passed into it, a Scyther and a Spearow had appeared. Of course, I had to go after these mons. The Scyther kept walking further into the ring. The thing was pretty damn stubborn. I think it took 5 Pokeballs before I finally caught it. When the GPS screen came back into view, I noticed I'd wandered dead center into the little purple ring. I looked up and gasped. I nearly dropped my phone, taking a few steps back instinctively. There were 3 other people standing around me, only 3 or so yards away. They hadn't said anything, and they hadn't made any noise at all. I'd had no idea they were even there until I finally looked up. What really scared me, though, was the fact they were all wearing these masks. White, expressionless masks, all the same ones. They looked like men. They were easily far taller and heavier than me. I didn't see any weapons on them, but this didn't make me feel any better. They stepped closer to me, almost in unison. Did they want to hurt me? I didn't know. Without saying anything, I turned around and ran home. As I did so, I heard several footsteps keeping speed behind me. I ran harder and faster. Say what you will, but at one point I think I even started to cry. I'd never been so scared in my life. Through watery eyes, it was difficult to see the trees in the dark in front of me. I almost ran face first into a few of them. The footsteps began to fade behind me, but they were quickly replaced with the sound of raucous laughter. It was loud and deep. I didn't stop though. I continued full speed ahead. Even after I was within view of my house, I ran inside and made sure everything was locked up. I found my father and mother and told them what happened. They checked the windows, and my dad walked outside a bit. He stayed on the porch afterward for a few hours, making sure no one tried to come out of those woods. That's easily my scariest experience, and I'm not sure I'll ever get over it. I don't know if it was just a bunch of guys trying to prank people or what. I mean, surely 3 guys bigger than me could have caught me easily if they wanted to. It still sends chills down my spine. I looked on my phone just yesterday. I was in bed and decided to see what was up with that purple ring. Turns out there really was a Pokestop out there in the middle of nowhere. When I selected it, the picture showed an oddly mangled tree. I actually recognized this tree too. It was called the Knotted Willow in my town. The only people I thought knew about it though were my family and the neighbors around us. Turns out someone had used a lure module on that Pokestop to attract Pokemon. Better yet, to attract people, such as me. I'll never know what they were really trying to do that day. Maybe they were just trying to play a prank on me or something. I felt too scared to head out there alone after, but I felt I needed to share this story to warn others about the dangers of getting lured in an online game. I'm what I would most certainly call a creep magnet. I get weirdos around me all the time. It's become a sort of joke I share with my friends and coworkers even, telling them of the many, oh so many creepers I've encountered in my time as a retail employee. I get all kinds of people in my store. I'm very well known for my bright attitude and overly chipper way of being, which has come to be liked by regulars and newcomers alike. It's also more than likely a contributing factor in why so many weirdos seem to crowd around me. That and my height. I'm a very short girl. I'm only 4'8", and I look even younger than my age of 21. I happen to be rather filled out for how young I look too, so add on another reason. Anyway, on to the story. This day was just like any other ordinary day. Working by myself in the store, checking out customers, and stocking shelves in my moments away from the register. At some point, I greeted a man with a large dark beard, bald and wearing dark glasses as he came in through the door. He immediately smiled and got that surprised look on his face that I've come to know. The sorta, I really feel like creeping on this girl today look. No biggie, I'm used to it and I know how to handle myself. Eventually, after an hour or two of being on register, I'd pretty much cleaned the store out of customers and moved on to stocking up the candy. The man with the beard approached me with a smile and held up a large white trash can. Excuse me? Yeah, I replied, glancing up from the box I was stocking. Are there any more of these in the back? This one doesn't have a lid. He gestured to the large trash can in his hand. Oh, yeah, I can go check that for you. I smiled and was polite like I always was with customers, before turning away and heading toward the stock room. I noticed he was following behind me, but I didn't really give it much thought. I glanced down the aisles for any other customers as I walked. I immediately took note of the store's complete emptiness. Well shit, I guess it's just us in here, I thought to myself. Moving through the stockroom door, I was relieved when the man stopped at the entrance. I'll be right back, I said, as I made a turn around some full-row containers, which due to just receiving a truck of supplies, our stockroom was full of them. They stood very tall and were like giant movable walls, very heavy, mind you. Being so small, I didn't have to move them very much to make a path through and see what was inside. After only a minute, I'd made myself a little path, having 3 heavy ones on my right and left, and in front of me as well. I decided I had to give up on my search for trash cans, though. Sighing, I went to turn around and inform the man of my defeat, only to find he was standing in my tiny path of walls. A very tight squeeze for a man of his stature, standing directly behind me. "Did you find them?" No, I don't think we had any." I tried to laugh and avoid acknowledging the creepy situation. I was in a very tiny area, with walls at my back and sides. Towering over me was this very robust man, standing in the way of my only exit. This room was also very far from any possible cameras, and there were no other employees in the store. I was helpless and growing increasingly scared at how this man didn't seem to want to let me get out. I voiced that I needed to return to work after a solid minute went by, but I was not able to get out a single word before he interrupted me in this creepy, almost shy voice. "You're just the cutest little thing. Did you know that?" Within an instant, I was terrified. I could just feel the ill intention oozing from this guy. Oh my God, this is how I die, I thought. Surprising myself though, I choked out without thinking. "I just heard my bell." He looked confused but didn't budge. "I just heard my bell. There are people up front who need to be checked out, and they're looking for me right now." I stood there nervously, knowing full well neither of us had heard that familiar ching from the service bell. "But what about my trash can?" he asked, stepping forward and taking a glance back. "I'll mark it down half price. No big deal." I laughed and tried to act as if nothing was out of the ordinary. I slipped by him, seeing my opening at his turning around in surprise. I tried my hardest to walk away, pretending to be calm as I exited the stock room. I sprinted to the front of the store the moment I was out of sight. The man wound up leaving after, without even purchasing his beloved trash can. This experience may not be so much terrifying as it is just really creepy. Then again, it may not be anything at all but a simple glitch. Still, I'd like to share it, because it really piqued my curiosity. I'm a Pokémon Go addict. I'm talking all day, every day. If the phone isn't right in front of my face, it's tucked away in my pocket, and I'm waiting for something to come. Now, I live out in the hills of Missouri. There's no flat land as far as the eye can see. I guess somehow though, thanks to Verizon, I still get reception most places. My Pokémon Go habit is easily enabled because of this. Unfortunately, as you might imagine, there aren't very many Pokéstops around here. I mean, why would there be? All that's here is trees around for miles on end. Whenever I went to actual civilization, like into town, I'd be sure to hit as many as possible before I had to go back home to the middle of nowhere. Really though, I think it's just crazy that they can program any Pokéstops all the way out here. It's really amazing. Anyway, this happened during the weekend. I was at home using some incense to lure my Pokémon prey to me. I kinda felt too lazy to get up and walk. Ever since I started playing, there has not been one single Pokéstop appearing nearby while I was at home. So when I saw a Pokéstop appear about 200 yards away, I was surprised to say the least. I remember wondering what the hell was going on. You know, when did that get here? What landmark would that even be? My damn house? There was nothing but woods around here. Curiosity took hold of me, and I'm sure you can guess what I did next. I threw on my shoes and stepped outside. I made my way toward this strange area. Of course, I tapped its icon on the screen to see what picture it would show. You know, at least explain which landmark this might be referring to. But when it loaded up, it was not like it was too bright to see. It's just that the picture was a blank white space. That was odd. If there was no picture, or even if it hadn't loaded correctly, wouldn't it have been black or something? It was like somebody had just uploaded a picture of white background space. The whole situation was getting weirder by the second. I was in the middle of the woods now, slowly getting closer to this alleged Pokéstop. I kept clicking the dang thing, but the picture would never change. No text either. Eventually, my little ring around my avatar hit the area I was looking for. The Pokéstop activated, so I spun it. I may as well have tried to grab the atoms in the air. All that came out were empty bubbles and a single egg. Yes, empty bubbles. 2 of the exact same text appeared, saying I had received some garbled jumble of text. The egg, of course, was a regular egg, one of the 10-kilometer ones. Lucky enough, I thought at the time I just hoped it wasn't an Eevee. I stayed there for a moment, just expecting something to finally load on my phone. I mean, I had full reception out here, but this damn thing refused to budge. It didn't change even after a few minutes, so I decided to walk back. I was starting to get real creeped out. I also started to hear footsteps somewhere in the woods around me, starting to follow me. I quickly fled away from the area. A couple of days passed by, and I had walked at least 30 kilometers, but not even 1/10 of a kilometer had registered on this weird egg. In fact, I had others in my inventory that had long since hatched, twice over at least. This egg from that creepy Pokéstop never even budged though. I'm still waiting to see if anything happens when it finally does. Maybe I'll update. To end on an even weirder note, that strange Pokéstop is gone now. I haven't seen it appear since either. I really hope it's just a glitch, but I don't know if someone hacked the app or what. About to move countries in 2015, my girlfriends and I decided to get together as a final bon voyage type of deal. We settled on our favorite pub, one we'd all frequented for the past 2 years. 5 of us managed to squeeze around a table and have a good laugh as we sipped on Chardonnay and kicked off the night with smiles and sentiment. We recalled fun stories, knowing that I wouldn't be seeing my friends again for years. 1 shot of fruity vodka later, my friend left the bar alone in order to get everyone another glass of Chardonnay. That drink now makes me gag just by hearing the name or tasting it today. I recall being a few sips in, maybe a quarter into my large glass, before I had no choice but to stop drinking. At the time, I only thought the alcohol hit me far faster than I was used to. It was strange considering I'd had a large dinner beforehand, which is generally safer than drinking on an empty stomach. It consumed my vision first. Moving my eyes was strained and heavy, and it made the surrounding walls of the pub shift slowly whenever I tried to focus my gaze. A similar sensation to hopping off a once spinning roundabout as a kid. Guys, I was surprised at how distant and slurred my voice was. So was everyone else at the table, considering they all fell silent at once. In that state, all I could get out was a single, "Something doesn't feel right," among yet another slur. In the brief moments I could hold my gaze long enough to look at my friends, I recall them exchanging uncomfortable glances before they started to laugh. "You're such a lightweight." That was that. Something I hold zero grudge for when we remember that my friends were tipsy at this point of the evening. I began rocking lightly in my chair, the movement subtle since I was simply trying to remain on my seat. My strained call of "something's wrong" were my last words for several hours, though not for lack of trying. One of my friends propped themselves between each of my arms, propping me like a drunken puppet for the rest of the night. While outside in the smoking area, I have a vague memory of a lone man without a drink in his hand, smirking at me. I thought it was odd that he was alone, but otherwise his misplaced amusement was easily coincidental without proof. With my head rolling over either of my shoulders, the stumbled steps and slurred protests, my friends were still settled on pub crawling even so. My memory became even darker. I could tell you the pubs we visited in vague enough order, but I have literally no memory of the areas between them. I may as well have teleported, considering the enormous gaps in my memory. People laughed at me as I sat on a bar stool struggling to stay upright, eyes rolling back into my lids whenever I couldn't focus my vision. It was only when I tried to hold a glass of water and couldn't even manage, spilling some on my friend's knee, that she finally decided to take me home. "Something's wrong," I tried to say again, stumbling and falling onto the pavement. They all laughed and complained once again that I was a lightweight. I woke up in my girlfriend's bed with vomit in my hair that I didn't even remember expelling. She asked me to leave her home in the morning, probably because I'd vomited in her bedroom. Nearly falling down the staircase multiple times, I managed to barely leave her place and walk down the dark, empty street all on my own. I fell down again in the pathway and simply passed out there. Somehow, I managed to get up once more after a while, though, and make it through the front door. I was met with my very angry and worried mother, who knows I drink responsibly. I'm the type to only remain tipsy so I may look out for my friends. Known to tuck everyone in with water and bread by their bedside. Needless to say, seeing me like this surprised her. I couldn't even try to speak despite trying. Only a slurred string of nonsense came out. When she left to another room, the last thing I remember is crawling up our stairs. After the next 10 to 12 hours, I woke up on my bedroom floor, tights ripped and one leg bruised from the earlier drops throughout the night. A pool of vomit was beside me, and I was struggling to breathe before blacking out again. It took me another 2 days to fully recover, which thankfully was in time for me to board my plane to another country. It was one hell of a send-off, that's for sure. For those wondering why I didn't go to the hospital, well, that's because I was fucking unconscious, and everyone around me shrugged off that I was unconscious for like 2 days as nothing more than a hangover. It was only years later when I told this story to some good friends that they shook some sense into me, confirming I'd been drugged that night. My theory is that some asshole spotted a group of young women enjoying a girls' night and dropped the drug into my drink at random when that friend had collected our glasses at the bar. He'd hoped to pick up one of us when the drug hit someone at random. I started work as a mailman a few months ago, and just last week I had an extremely bad experience. There's this one house that every time I deliver there, I always see a person watching me through their front window, and I mean every single time too. I had always just chalked this up to maybe an elderly person who had nothing better to do or something. After a while of it happening every single time, it didn't freak me out nearly as much anymore. One day though, I had to finish delivering mail on another carrier's route. They'd had an emergency and had to stop early for some reason. When I was finished with theirs, I had to finish my own as well. As I made it to the particular house where that person would watch me every single day, I saw they were not there at the window this time. This kinda made me happy actually, but it also creeped me out a bit. It meant the person always knew about what time I would normally be there, and specifically looked out the window at that exact time to see me. I dropped the mail into their slot and continued on. I still had 3 more houses before I had to return to my truck and grab all the mail for the next street over. When I'd finally finished delivering those letters, I went back to the truck to grab the rest. That's when I saw a weird-looking lady standing under the streetlight right behind it. She looked like she was on drugs or something. Her hair was a complete mess, and she was wearing gray sweat clothes. They were covered with stains all over. She smiled at me with all her missing teeth. She then called out to me, "Hello." I said hello back and started gathering the mail for the next street. I didn't have my eye on her as I did this, but I felt like she was walking up behind me all of a sudden. I turned around, and she was indeed much closer than before, now standing in the center of the street. Do you need something?" She said she didn't. "Okay, well, I'm gonna continue on then. Have a good day." With all the mail ready to go, I closed the back door and made sure everything was locked up. I started walking away. I felt relieved to be walking away from this strange-looking woman. I had delivered to about 6 more houses on the route when I noticed that same woman was now crouching next to a truck in the shadows. She was following me. I was sure of it. It seemed she thought I couldn't see her there. I continued on, but after every single house, I saw she was keeping up with me, obviously trying to hide. Needless to say, this was pretty damn scary. There was nobody else around at this time, and I felt like she might attack me at any moment. I delivered the mail to the final house. Sure enough, when I walked back to the sidewalk, I could see her standing in a shadow by a big tree across the street. I decided I could not continue on like this. I walked over to confront her. She stiffened up as she saw me approaching her. I called out to her, "Why are you following me?" She didn't respond. Instead, what she did made my heart sink. She let out this guttural noise, the kind only a crazy person could make, like she was scared of me or something. She started whooping and hollering, and then she ran away. She was definitely on something. The next day when I came to that house where I would always see somebody watching me through the window, she was there once again. I know it was her that followed me that night. I'm a United States Postal Service carrier. Something very weird and creepy happened to me a few weeks ago on my route. I've been carrying mail for about 4 years now, and have had the same route for about 2 of those. It's a decent area to deliver mail, and I've never really had a problem with it compared to some other bad areas around my city that I've unfortunately had to deliver in the past. But hey, some carriers have to deliver in those shady neighborhoods every single day, so I felt like I got pretty lucky with mine. I always go to this one specific park right in the middle of my route to eat my lunch every single day. There's never really too many people there when I am, but this day there were 2 little girls playing on the playground. This park was a pretty good size, and the playground was surrounded by pathways, beautiful flowers, and even a few fountains as well. The 2 girls showed up to the playground after I sat down at the picnic area, about 20 minutes before. They were doing their own thing, and I was texting my girlfriend and watching videos on my phone, when out of nowhere, this guy just came up behind me. "You better get out of here, or I'll call the police on you, you damn pervert." I was shocked and literally speechless. I spun around to look at who just said that. It was a huge guy, probably around 300 pounds or so. He was balding and wearing these old-looking glasses. I couldn't even think of what to say before he spoke again. "You get the hell out of here, or I'll beat the hell out of you." My face turned red with fear. "Come on, man, I'm just eating my lunch. I'm not sure what the problem is." The man huffed at me and turned around, then started walking away down the path. I sat there in awe for a few seconds, then looked at my phone to check the time. I still had about 5 minutes left of lunch break. I texted my girlfriend about that huge guy, then looked over to the playground. I saw the 2 girls now standing at the top of a big wooden slide, and I saw the man below them. He seemed to be talking to them or something. My initial thoughts was that he must have been their parent and got pissed off when he thought I was staring at them, when really I was just eating my lunch. Then, though, I saw him reach up and try to grab one of the girl's ankles. The girl let out a brief scream, and I stood up right away. The man looked around nervously in all directions, trying to see if anyone might have seen him. Well, he must have forgotten that I was still there, or maybe he assumed I had been intimidated and left already. I have no idea what his thoughts were, but I started walking right over to them. After seeing that, I got in real close, and I could see the girls looked absolutely terrified. "Hey, do you guys know this man?" The man turned around and had a very scared but angry look on his face. The girls both told me they had no idea who he was. The man started to speed walk away immediately after. I watched as he began to run out the front gate of the park. I asked the girls if they had a phone and could call someone to come get them. One of the girls did, and called somebody out to take them home. I'm not sure who they called, but I waited there with them until I saw an older woman enter the park. She walked over to us and asked what was happening. I told her everything. She didn't really react like I thought she would, though. She seemed annoyed or something, like actually annoyed at the little girls. She told them to get down and that they were leaving. After the three of them left, I checked my phone again. I was now 35 minutes behind schedule, so I quickly walked out of the park and turned to go down the sidewalk toward my truck. I got my truck unlocked and got inside. I started the engine and started driving a few blocks down that same street when I saw the same man sitting in a small red car. He was glaring at me as I drove by him. I grabbed my phone out and called my boss. I told him everything I saw, and he said he would call the cops for me. The rest of my shift, I thought about that guy. I felt bad for just leaving like that and not doing anything. When I got back to the office, my boss told me he did call the police. They went over to that park. I really hope they caught that guy. I haven't seen him or the girls there since. First, I'd like to start off this story by saying I'm a relatively open-minded individual. I have no issues going to places where I know I would otherwise stand out. But hey, that's what makes it fun. I like to surround myself with people who don't all look and act like me. It keeps things interesting and ensures there's always a new thing for me to try or a new place to visit. You know, I'm kind of a thrill seeker. And because of this, when I found myself going to a gay bar with my friend Eli, I figured all I was in for was a night of fun and partying. That's not exactly what I ended up getting, though. I'm currently 29, but this took place around 2017 or so. Back then, I was a mostly careless guy when it came to ensuring my own safety in sketchy situations. I just like to have fun, and if I'm sometimes getting hurt, that's a fair price to pay for a good time. The worst thing that ever happened to me on a wild night out was a broken wrist, but even then I just laughed it off and didn't take it too seriously. My motto's always been, never be afraid of life. Eli picked me up from my apartment in Santa Monica, California, and we started that god-awful drive to West Hollywood and his favorite gay bar. I'm not gay myself, but Eli is, and I figured anywhere he'd like to go had to be a good time. He certainly knew how to party. We found a place to park a few blocks away and started walking toward the bar, both excited for a fun night ahead of us. We had to wait in line for about an hour, but when we finally got inside, it was even better than I had imagined. There were people of all shapes and sizes and the coolest outfits, all dancing with one another. The drinks looked amazing, and everyone was clearly having a good time. I found my way to the dance floor with Eli, and we showed off our horrible moves for everyone to see. The vibe was simply incredible. I asked myself why it had taken me so long to go to a gay bar when they seemed so much fun. I sat down and ordered a beer. As I tried to catch my breath from dancing, an older man in his late 50s sat down next to me. He asked me if it was my first time in a bar like this. I was confused as to how he might know that. He must have picked up on my confusion, because he then said this. "Oh, you know, Eli comes here all the time, and I've never seen you before, so I just kinda assumed." I remember awkwardly laughing, confirming his suspicions. He told me his name was Jeremy, and offered to buy me another beer, which I happily agreed to. He seemed like a nice enough guy who was making a decent effort to try and talk to me. We talked for about 30 minutes when I started to feel lightheaded and dizzy. Figured I must have had too much to drink so far throughout the night. I said my goodbyes to Jeremy and began making my way through the bar to look for Eli to take me home. Except I only managed to take a single step before I started to fall over. Jeremy put his arm around me to hold me up and told me he'd seen Eli had left only 15 minutes before. He could still give me a ride home though, no problem. I started feeling a little worried now, but Jeremy had been nothing but nice to me. I told him that would be great, so long as I could get a hold of Eli first to make sure he was okay and tell him who I was leaving with. Jeremy agreed and began to help me outside, basically having to carry my body. I got more and more numb with each step I took. When we got outside, I realized soon enough I was no longer able to walk, and my speech had become completely slurred. I was even starting to black out. This is when I began to panic. I knew this was not from drinking too much. This was a real problem. I looked over at Jeremy, who now only seemed focused on getting me to his van across the lot. At some point, I remember even feeling my feet skid across the pavement, while Jeremy dragged me across the asphalt. I tried reaching for my phone in my pocket, but when I looked down toward my hand, it wasn't even moving. My thoughts started to become foggy. Then I heard a voice come from behind us. "Hey man, is he okay? He doesn't look too good." I knew I was in trouble when Jeremy replied, "Oh yeah, he's fine. My boyfriend doesn't know how to hold his liquor." I was internally screaming, but no sound would come out of my mouth. I knew if I got into this man's van, I would not be coming back out. Thankfully, whoever this kind savior was didn't give up and offered to call an ambulance since I looked so bad. Of course, Jeremy refused. By then, my savior was attracting a crowd that started to slowly coalesce. They forced Jeremy to lay me down, and then everything went completely black. The next thing I remember is being in the back of an ambulance with Eli asking me what happened and how I got in such a bad state and still managed to get outside. Apparently, when the ambulance and officers arrived, Jeremy was nowhere to be found. Eli had never left the bar. I genuinely believe the only reason I'm still able to tell this story here and now is because of that unknown man who had the courage to speak up on my behalf. It turns out Jeremy had spiked the beer he ordered for me with Rohypnol, probably the most well-known roofie, and I carelessly accepted it from him. I filed a police report, and this Jeremy, or whatever his name actually was, has never been seen since. I'm scared for all the people out there who might be victimized by his cruelty and lack of human decency. I asked Eli how he even knew him, and he told me Jeremy had only asked his name minutes before taking a seat with me. Everything he did was calculated, and he did it with such ease while acting completely calm too. I haven't let this discourage me from going back to that bar, and I don't want to let it discourage anyone else either. I do want to warn anyone out there who takes their life and safety for granted though. Don't do that. You never know how quickly you can find yourself in a situation where you have no control over what happens to you. Please be careful. I'm in my 30s now, but when I was 11 years old, I had a frightening experience with a mailman. I was at the kitchen table with my mom, and we were making some cookies and brownies. We were mixing things up, and my mom said she didn't have enough eggs for what we were making. She washed her hands quickly and told me she was going to run to the store and be right back. I stayed there at the table, sitting in the wooden chair and watching TV. It was on in the living room next to me. I'm not sure how long after my mom had left, but the mailman appeared at the kitchen door and tried opening it without saying a single word. Thankfully, my mom had locked it. The man tried to speak to me through the door though. "Hey, can you unlock the door? I need to bring this package inside." I felt sick to my stomach. This mailman was a big guy, and he looked real creepy too. I told him he could just leave the package on the porch, but he told me he could not do that. "Oh no, I can't leave this package. It has some expensive things inside. Just open up and I'll be on my way right after." I didn't know what to say. Right after that, my brother had walked into the living room after coming down the stairs. He walked across the room and into the kitchen with me. Then he stopped by the brownie mix and dipped his finger in. He asked me where Mom was. I looked past him to the kitchen door. The man was now gone. I got up and looked outside. I could see he hadn't left the box he was carrying. My brother didn't think anything of this at all, but my mom was a little weirded out when she got home. I saw our mailman a couple days later, and I realized it was not even the same guy. That was something I hadn't noticed in the moment. Something else I never realized at the time, but did when I got older, is how the mailman would even know there was something expensive inside the package to begin with. What would have happened if I had opened the door? I have no idea. Okay, so a little background. This happened around 7 years ago, when I was 13 years old. My mom had just gotten married, maybe 2 years before, to my now stepdad Greg, who also had a daughter. We'll call her Lucy. She was 9 when my mom and Greg got married. We moved into a pretty big neighborhood. It had a pool and various playgrounds, and they were fairly close to the house as well. And because of this, one day, I believe it was a Saturday to be exact, Lucy wanted to go down to the playground to play. I agreed to take her with me. I got my bike and Lucy rode on the handlebars, occasionally getting off and walking beside me. This took us about 10 to 15 minutes to get there. We weren't very far away from the house at all. We got to the playground and I sat down on the swings, while Lucy did whatever she felt like doing, playing in the sand, the jungle gym, etc. During this time, a mail truck pulled up right next to the playground and proceeded to just watch and stare at us. I thought it was pretty weird, but I didn't really pay much attention to it at first. I also didn't recognize the mailman either. The usual mailman was an older guy, very friendly. The guy parked at the playground was a much younger guy. After about 10 minutes of him just staring at us, Lucy came over and spoke to me. "Hey, Emily, why is the mailman just sitting over there?" I told her I didn't know, so how about we ask him? He was only about 50 feet away from us. Lucy yelled over to him, "Hey, what are you doing?" The man responded, "Just watching you." We immediately looked at each other, and I whispered to her, "That's pretty weird." Thinking back on it, the way he said it makes me shiver to this day. It was just extremely creepy. I've always been pretty street smart since I was little, and I didn't like the vibe I was getting from this guy. I decided it was time to leave now. We walked over to my bike, not looking in the guy's direction at all, and started to leave. I was pedaling slowly on my bike, while Lucy was walking beside me. After 30 seconds though, I stopped and looked behind me. The mailman was following us. He stopped when I noticed him. This continued maybe about 5 or 6 times. Each time I looked back, I would always give him the rudest looks, and he'd stop following us for just a moment. I told Lucy to hop on my bike handles, and we noped the hell out of there. I pedaled fast enough to turn on this one corner and go up some random person's driveway and hide behind some bushes without him having seen it. The supposed mailman drove past, and after a few minutes, we went back to my house as quickly as possible. I never told my mom what happened. I don't think Lucy was even really frightened that much, to be honest. And that's mostly because she was too young to know what was going on, though. She was also pretty ditzy, so that didn't help much either. Fast forward a couple of months later, there was something on the news or in the newspaper. I can't quite remember exactly. My mom was telling me about some guy in a mail van who attempted to get some girls to get in. It was in my neighborhood. The girls ran home and naturally told their parents. I didn't really think anything of it until the guy was actually found. They showed a picture of him on the news, and guess who it was? That mailman I'd seen that day. I just kind of stared in disbelief. I didn't tell my mom or anyone else. Actually, until right now, I just kind of thought to myself, wow, that's pretty scary. It was pretty scary, but I'd put myself in lots of dangerous situations when I was younger. I guess that's why it didn't really faze me so much until now. I honestly mostly forgot about it too, until a couple of years ago. I'm not sure why that guy had a mail truck or what he was trying to do, but I know he did have one. I'm glad I didn't end up in it that day. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any feedback for me as well, be sure to leave that in comments below the video. If you guys have a story you'd like to send in, or if you'd like to contact me for any reasons, there will be links to my social media in the description below the video, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description below the video. Please make sure to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with, and try to use as much proper grammar as possible to make sure you have the highest chance of appearing in a future video. Overall, I think that's pretty much it for now, guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.